Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, my name is Tanya Fernandez Anderson, the District 7 City Councilor. I am the chair of Boston City Council Committee on Ways and Means. This hearing is being recorded. It is being live streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV and broadcast on Xfinity Channel 8, RCN Channel 82, and Files Channel 964. The Council's budget review process will encompass a series of public hearings beginning in April and running through June. We strongly encourage residents to take a moment to engage in this process by giving testimony for the record. You can do this in several ways. By attending one of our hearings and give public testimony, we will take public testimony at each departmental hearing and also at 2 hearings dedicated to public testimony. The full hearing schedule is on our website at boston.gov/council-budget. Our scheduled hearings dedicated to public testimony, one was April 26th at 6 p.m. and the next one on June 2nd at 6 p.m. You can give testimony in person here in the chamber or virtually via Zoom. For in-person testimony, please come to the chamber and sign up on the sheet near the entrance. For virtual budget review website, for virtual testimony, you can sign up by using online form on our council budget review website or by emailing the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov. When you are called to testify, please state your name and affiliation, residence, and limit your comments to 2 minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. Email your written testimony to the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov. Submit a 2-minute video of your testimony through the form on the website. For more information on the City Council budget process and how to testify, please visit the City Council's budget website at boston.gov/council-budget. Today's hearing is on Dockets 0480-0482, orders for the FY23 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, for the school committee, and for other post-employment benefits OPEB. Docket 0483, orders for capital fund transfer appropriations. Dockets 0484 to 0486, orders for the capital budget, including loan orders and lease purchase agreements. Our focus area for this hearing will be Boston Public Schools academics, including opportunity and achievement gap, curriculum, code of conduct, English learners, special education and inclusion, literacy, early education or universal pre-K, special curricular programs, AP, credit recovery, age 22, vocational education, graduation and career readiness, libraries, MCAS, Office of Elementary Schools, Office of Secondary Schools. Do you need me to repeat those items? You good? Our panelists for today's hearings are Nathan Cooter, Boston Public Schools Chief Financial Officer, Drew Etchelson, BPS Deputy Superintendent of Academics, Farah Asaraj, BPS Deputy Chief Academic Officer, Monica Hogan, BPS Senior Executive Director, Data and Accountability, You're Monica Hogan? All right, and that's it for now. I am joined today by my council colleagues, Aaron Murphy at large, Kendra Lara, District 6, Julia Mejia at large, Ruthzi Lujan at large. I will now turn to the floor for administration for their presentation. Prior to that, just so you know, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. And if you require more time, we ask that you continue after the questioning. We'll go to first round of questions to my council colleagues. They will have 5 to 7 minutes to question. It is on them to manage that time between their questions and your answers. Then we'll go to public testimony if there are any people on the list. And then we'll go to second round and a third in that pattern. Without further ado, administration, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to members of the City Council for having us here. Just a fair warning, I'm going to be very short. I know I've had an opportunity to share digitally the presentation. I'm sure everyone's had a chance to review it. So I'll make some opening remarks and then try to repurpose our time for two-way dialogue and questions that I know are really important to you and to the city. And we're excited to engage in a conversation about how we're best using our resources to have a return on investment and to improve academic outcomes for our students. I want to acknowledge many of my colleagues who are here from the Boston Public Schools, both for support and also to potentially answer some questions. I want to just make 3 quick points that I think are summarized well in the PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll turn it over to you, Chair, for facilitation of questions. I want to just own and acknowledge up front that Boston Public Schools needs to do better. Our outcomes are not what they need to be for students. There are persistent and inexcusable racial achievement gaps that need to be addressed. There are gaps for our multilingual learners and our students with disabilities. And all too often, the system has been set up such that some students benefit from the system and other students for far too long have been marginalized by the system. Those are issues that sort of root and branch need to be addressed, and those are things that we're really committed to doing from an academic perspective. And while it's true, and we have to own and be transparent and honest about all that we have to do that's better to better serve our families and to better serve our students, I operate from a position of hope because there's so much strength in our system too. There's brilliant and rich diversity. We have amazing families who are committed and come to the table every day. We are a system that holds, community equity roundtables, and we take a lot of feedback. And I think we have to discipline ourselves better to respond to that feedback in really important ways. But we do create space for that feedback, and I think that that's really important. The system has made some adjustments that I think are important, that I think will help strengthen the work that we have to do ahead. For example, our transition to a more rigorous set of graduation requirements through the MassCore graduation requirement policy that the school committee bravely passed, I think is game-changing for our students. We have delivered on service delivery for particularly our multilingual learners that has the highest rates of compliance in our monitoring reports. I will acknowledge that we have to do far more work to improve the quality of instruction that happens for those students, but we've made a significant lift in the way that we are providing services that are federally and state required for students in a way that we haven't done in the past. We're moving toward a more inclusive system, and that's particularly true at our grades K to 8 in terms of inclusion scenes for students with disabilities. And we've launched, I think, some leading work in the Commonwealth around equitable literacy, which I know we'll dig into based on the questions that have been submitted to us. I'm also finally just proud of some of the tutoring options that we provided for students, particularly a specific program that we're offering called Paper that allows our students access in 9 different languages to 24/7 tutoring to support them in their work. But there are persistent gaps that continue to exist. These gaps are inexcusable, and we have to more aggressively, through a multi-tier approach, improve instruction. I think you'll see in our investments in the PowerPoint, this will be my final thought before I turn it over to you, I think some really clear investments that are very intentionally and strategically trying to move us forward in a way that I think is really important. One, the investment in equitable literacy. The design of our equitable literacy system has been so intentional to focus on new dyslexia guidance, to push us toward a more native language instruction and literacy model, to provide increased access to libraries, and increased access to ethnic studies program, which is now a part of our Mass Core graduation requirements. Second, we need to improve outcomes and opportunities for our multilingual learners and our students with disabilities. And our high school redesign work, which is promising, needs significant work. You'll see that the foundation for this is built around an expectation that all students have access to the Mass Core graduation requirements, have access to inclusive learning opportunities, as well as access to native language instruction. That strategy plus access to the core four around career technical education opportunities, around pre-AP and AP options, IB options in early college and dual enrollment, that is a really powerful and important strategy that I think could help redesign our high school experience. I'll say that this is my third time working in the BPS. It's an organization that I love. And I think that there are certain things that we're really good at. We know how to put together really powerful and beautiful, polished presentations, but we don't always implement and execute in the way that we're supposed to. And given that, I have asked Edvestors to serve as a backbone organization to really help us in our work to ensure that we deliver in the way that we promised that we will around our high school redesign work. And all this is undergirded by a belief that all of our students should have access to a high quality education through the quality guarantee, which I know you've had an opportunity to probably dig into on Monday, and we're certainly happy to talk to you about and to answer any questions you might have. So I'll turn it over to you, Chair, to help facilitate some question and answers and any two-way dialogue that you'd like relative to the academics presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Which one is the academic? Is it the same one that was just presented earlier today?
The presentation that is on the screen is a different one than that was presented this morning. This covers the more specific academic framework and academics team investments.
I'm also happy to go through it. I was just told that I was shared with you all digitally, so I just assumed everyone had it. I apologize.
No worries. I think that with the last 13 minutes that you have, I think you should go through the presentation.
Great, awesome. Is there a clicker?
If it doesn't work, I can stand up too.
Thank you. I had received feedback that you all wanted to get into questions, so I just wanted to be respectful of that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I think the strategy of our investments relative to the academic investments focus on three challenges that we're trying to resolve. One, we have too much variability in our system around students' opportunity and access to meet the graduation requirements that lead to college and career success. Some students in our system have access to that, but oftentimes many students don't, and we have to address that problem. Challenge number two is responding to very explicit and clear academic discrepancies in academic outcomes that our data tells us around how our students are currently performing. So those academic outcomes for students, especially for our Black students, our students with disabilities, our multilingual learners, and our multilingual learners with disabilities, needs to be actively addressed through a multi-tier system of support, and that's focused on high-quality Tier 1 instruction. Challenge number three is that based on inequities within the system, we have some schools that are fully delivering on most elements of the quality guarantee, and there are other schools that aren't doing that, and we have to take that as a systems problem. We have to address that really actively, and you'll see investments in our FY23 budget that are attempted to tackle that problem. Going to the next slide, which tries to unpack a little bit about challenge one, which is the variability in student opportunity to meet the adopted Mass Core graduation requirements. we have data that leads us to the conclusion that we need to further invest in this area. Currently, the majority of our current high school students do not meet all the MAS core requirements. We've done an analysis of where those areas are, and we've worked with our individual heads of schools to address those issues. Only 37% of last year's graduating class met all the MAS core requirements. And 3, when the data is disaggregated by race, students with disabilities, and English learners, that gap widens. Just to back up for a moment, just to put this in context, the MAS core graduation requirements are a new policy that was adopted in the spring of 2021 by the Boston School Committee. And the intent was to ensure that all students graduate their high school experience from the city of Boston having met a set of requirements and courses that the state and the system agree prepare our students for the demands of college and career. This is a really important, I think in a transparent way, for us to be really clear that all too often we are preparing students, or graduating students who have not met those expectations, and an investment in this area is critical. And so you'll see attached to that sort of analysis of data, the investments that we're making to address that. $6.2 million to support all high schools to implement MAS core in 9th grade. The policy starts this year, this upcoming school year, with our 9th grade students. And an additional $3.2 million in 9th grade guidance counselors, whose main and core responsibility it will be to track and support students to ensure that they are graduating from high school, meeting the requirements of the MAS core graduation. I will just say that an important part of the process for us this year has been for the academics team to meet with each head of school and to ensure that their schools have been designed so that they are actually fully delivering on the expectation for the 9th grade students. The way the system is set up often is that decisions get made months and months earlier, and if you don't set up your system appropriately, then you can't actually deliver months later on what's expected for our students. And we have high levels of confidence going into this, that we've designed a system and designed our schools so that those students that are entering 9th grade will have those opportunities. Challenge 2 is around academic outcomes for students, especially our outcomes for our Black students, our students with disabilities, our multilingual learners, and our multilingual learners with disabilities. The data that supports that challenge include our growth assessment, which we call MAP, and our MCAS scores, our state standards-based assessment. Those scores are lower for our students with disabilities, our English learners, our Black students, and our Latinx students compared to their white and Asian peers. These gaps are inexcusable and demonstrate, from my perspective, a tier 1 problem across the system, that some students are not getting access to the type of instruction that leads to grade level expectation. We have an average daily attendance rate that has decreased during COVID by 3%, and that has disproportionately impacted some groups of students. In terms of the investments, for this FY23, we are investing $5 million to support a transition of our Office of English Learners to an Office of Multilingual Learners that is putting at the core a shift toward more native language instruction, dual language programs across the city, because we know the research is very clear that academic outcomes improve when all students have access to native language instruction. We're putting in $10 million to expand academic counseling. That's in addition to the $5 million I just talked about for 9th graders. And this is academic counselors for students in grades kindergarten to grade 8, all part of the quality guarantee. We are investing $6.7 million in our Reimagine Schools initiative, practices and structures to support our students with disabilities and to continue to make a shift toward more inclusive practices, particularly at the secondary school level. And $6 million, just shy of $6 million in our equitable literacy work, which I hope we'll talk about today. And then finally, I'll just make one last slide before I turn it back. is that we also know, because of historical inequities in the system, that we are not offering the same thing for all students across all schools, and I'm sure that probably came up in your school's conversation earlier this morning. And we have to take action when we notice these types of inequities. And I think it's shown in who gets access to the type of quality guarantees that we think are part of a high-quality education. And we lay out in a much more substantial way in some of the other sort of supplemental documents, but we think that every school should have access to sort of high-quality, culturally responsive curriculum through a high-quality academics program, that our schools need access to enrichment. That's what our families are telling us, right? They want access to before and after school care. They want access to debate and student government. And they want access to arts and sports and other enrichment. And that has to be part of a high-quality education in the city of Boston. I'm glad that we're investing in that in our FY23 budget. I'm sure you all have had many conversations about our capital budget, both at the city side and in the Boston Public Schools. But our facilities are something that need major addressing, and obviously we hope to be able to partner with both the City Council and the Mayor's office on that. But our current facilities all too often do not provide students the type of access to things like science labs, to technology, to library, to gyms, and performance spaces that really should be part of a high-quality education. And for too long, we've tolerated in the city of Boston that those things are okay to not have in the Boston Public Schools, and that needs to be addressed. And then finally, to ensure that resources are in place for our students, families, and so that our students, families, and communities can thrive. These are things like adjustment counselors and school counselors embedded within our schools, social workers, school nurses are all part of sort of the wraparound services that we want to ensure our students have access to. And so you'll see below the types of investments that are made in our FY23 budget to tackle that third challenge. So I'll turn it over to you, Chair. That was probably about my time at this point. And we're happy to engage in as many questions or commentary as you all have.
Thank you, Ms. Elchison. Councilor Murphy, you have the floor.
Thank you for that. I have two questions in this first round. We know that many times students who had dyslexia were not identified that way, and we didn't consider it a disability. So then when the families went and the teachers were advocating for reading supports at the IEP meetings, they weren't getting specific dyslexia services. So if you could just walk me through, because I know we are following the dyslexia guidelines now, but from the screening to the intervention plan when they're at the IEP meeting, like once we identify that they do. So if you could just confirm that we are identifying students and not having families pay their own money to get outside testing done, and then how do the services look? What does the service delivery look like for these students?
Yeah, I'm gonna, if I talk for too long, just interrupt me.
Will,
And
yeah,
if I know you will.
No, thank you.
And just let me know if I'm not exactly answering your question. There's a lot of parts to this, and I think it's a really, really important question. I'm proud of many things of the team's work here in the Boston Public Schools, but nothing makes me prouder than the work that we've done around equitable literacy. You've formerly worked in the Boston Public Schools, so you know it's really hard for BPS to pivot really quickly for a whole host of reasons. And for far too long in the Boston Public Schools, we invested in programs, and this is true across the Commonwealth, this is not just exclusive to the Boston Public Schools, but in reading programs that are not consistent with what the science of reading tells us about what students ought to have access to. Mm-hmm. And we have really shifted our practice in this way, and in really important ways that I think are really important. One is from assessment perspective. So we've invested in the last year or so in screeners that are mandated across the entire system so that we have good early data around the reading abilities of our students. And we have students, we are able to identify students who may be at risk for dyslexia without early interventions. Mm-hmm. The fact that we have had the vast majority of our schools, even our autonomous schools, fully participating in these assessments is another, I think, really important win across our system. It's something that our school leaders and our educators now understand is really, really important. I think as part of our sort of former sort of curriculum that we've implemented, it wasn't clear to me in the past that the phonics curriculum or programming was as strong as it needed to be. And with our program in Focus and the sort of correlated phonics programs that are attached to that, as well as to the Foundations program in our later years, we finally, I think in a really important way, have strong phonics programs across the system. Farah Azaraj is running our MTSS work, multi-tiered systems of support, and we're building out Tier 2 and Tier 3 systems. You'll see in our FY23 budget investments in a large number of reading interventionists across the system. I think there was a time when reading interventionists were like, there was evidence of those positions across the BPS. And it's really important that particularly for our students who need those supports that they're in place. And so we're building out a sort of foundation, an infrastructure, if you will, to ensure that we actually have people in place to provide direct services to students based on our analysis of data of how students are doing relative to their reading level, and particularly responding to students who might be at risk for dyslexia without intervention.
Are we still paying for students to be placed outside the district? Because families can prove that we're not providing Horton Gillingham or other specific reading instruction for them?
Yeah, we, at my request, the team has worked to identify every licensed and certified educator in both Wilson and Horton Gillingham. And we're able to identify what specific schools they're at and sort of deploy individuals in creative and strategic ways to ensure that not only these new positions that I've talked about in terms of the reading interventionists, but that those folks are also available to provide resources. We could provide those resources in the BPS for sure. Now, I think some of these things are individual conversations around whether out-of-district placements are needed, and so those are things that have to work through the team process, as you know. But we are resourced and prepared to ensure that students with dyslexia or at risk for dyslexia have the support that they need in the Boston Public Schools.
Thank you. I probably have 30 seconds, but thank you for that answer. My second question is the idea of this top-down, which I don't think works, and I was an early childhood educator, so I often will advocate for the strong foundation. And when we talk about 37% of our students we're finding out at graduation are not meeting what they need, it's way too late. Like, we wait till 6th grade when kids take a test to say, oh wait, we haven't prepared everyone to move on to different options. So what are we doing in this system to make sure that we're not waiting till we find out that we failed them, that we're starting beforehand?
Yeah. The first, and I'll turn over to Farah maybe to sort of expand on my answer, but the first thing that I think is really important is that we sort of root and branch have rethought curriculum. So we have really strong curriculum now in our early years through a revised Focus program that I think is really high quality. We're excited, and I hope I can say this out loud, but we're excited to submit that to Ed Reports to get it rated, and we expect that it will be rated quite high given the amazing work of the team. We're also at grades 3 to 6, we've been, as our core Tier 1 program, have been investing in Excellence for All. It has expeditionary learning at its core. It has the Foundations Phonics program. But then also brings with it world language options for students, really creative inquiry-based science programming that we think is all part of the quality guarantee that should be part of a high-quality education. That is game-changing when it's implemented well, because our students are getting access to grade-level material, they're getting access to complex grade-level culturally affirming texts, and those are the types of investments we need to continue to make to strengthen the program. And I'll have Farah just add a little bit more about some of the MTSS work, if that's okay, because I think it's really important.
Oh, absolutely, and it's a really great question because the analysis for Mass Core adoption began at the district level, in which we actually analyzed every course. There was a massive effort that Christine Landry led in the BPS with multiple, obviously, team members. But in conjunction with working with schools, we've identified where there's scheduling programmatic. For example, we have Marston Arts Academy, which has a beautiful humanities program. So some of the courses did not necessarily match with the Mass Core alignment. So we have an individualized response to every school to ensure that there is an alignment to the new Mass Core requirements. In addition to that, facilities, for example, if we are adopting the Mass Core requirements that require a lab, that there needs to be a facilities and a structure and certainly classroom environment that will provide those opportunities for those students. So we are moving that forward in the secondary pathways as well in 7th to 12th grades, where some students have access to advanced algebra, let's say in the 9th or 10th grade, because they've participated, let's say, in 9th grade algebra in the 8th grade. So there is some double dosing of courses that have also, depending on the schools, that have also taken place. And so we're looking at the system in terms of what we need to do, which is ensuring that we provide guidance counselors at the 9th grade. So we are investing $8 million in the schools and secondary schools so that there is a pathway and a plan for every student, to your point, and ensuring that it's not always a college track, and that we make sure for our students who are choosing a different pathway that we also support their pathway for career advancement and certificates, as well as union trades and other opportunities. So that is the big shift that we really are focused on in the secondary schools, and how we also provide that tiered support.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Councilor Lara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the BPS administration for coming to answer our questions today. I'm excited about this hearing. Most of my questions are going to be around curriculum, alternative schools, and special education, as they're three of my main interests. I am not a teacher myself, but my studies in college were focused around radical pedagogy specifically. And so a lot of my work and a lot of the things that are my interests around BPS is that we know that the traditional pedagogical practices don't work for every student, right? That we don't have standardized students, and therefore what we're expecting academically and how we're teaching doesn't necessarily work, particularly for Black and brown students who have, come to our schools experiencing trauma, violence from either living in, and violence defined widely, living in poverty, racism, so on and so forth. And so I'm curious, particularly around the curriculum and the pedagogical practices with the alternative schools. Because they are alternative schools, they have more flexibility around the pedagogical practices, around how they deliver the curriculum. And we've seen that the model in a lot of ways works, but we've seen, it works better for young people of color. And we've also seen in other schools who teach their academic curriculum more traditionally that they have higher attrition rates for Black and brown young people, and so on and so forth. And so obviously this is a budget conversation, so we're not going to speak specifically, but I'm curious about the financial investment that makes way for kind of like that level of creative curriculum implementation, and how, if we are at all investing in making sure that schools have access to getting more creative. We know that the majority of our BPS students are students of color, and so we can't, Ms. Eccleston, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Eccleston. I really appreciate how candid you were in your presentation, right? You painted a very clear picture that we are not where we need to be. And I don't think that the answer to that is to add more rigor in the traditional way that we've been delivering curriculum, because obviously that's not working for our students based on where they come from. So I'm curious about if you've made any financial investments in the budget, or anticipate with, to rethink and how we're doing curriculum, specifically around like rigor and traditional academics.
Yeah, I'll start, and then maybe Farah can add. So I think one of the intentional decisions we made in terms of the design of our equitable literacy work was to start with who our students were, right? And like, maybe that doesn't seem like such a radical idea, but I think all too often that doesn't happen, right? And so we tried to think about who are those students in the Boston Public Schools, and how do we design and approve curriculum and select curriculum that is culturally affirming and responds to the needs of our students and for our community. And so our work has focused by sort of really taking a look at Goldie Muhammad's work, which, if you haven't had a chance to read it, I think is really both inspiring and exactly what you're talking about in terms of sort of a more radical approach to the way that we think about pedagogy and we think about what kind of content we're putting in front of students. And, you know, she writes a lot about and talks a lot about, and when she's met with our principal corps and our folks on the academics team, around just starting with this sort of idea of joy, right? How do we like ensure that we have a curriculum that excites our students, that talks about and frames for things, both windows and mirrors into their lived experiences? And how do we sort of draw off the community? And that's what I think our expeditionary learning program does. Like, how do we draw off the assets and strength of our community in terms of the way that we're sort of designing and thinking about the learning opportunities for our students? Part of your question also, I think, if I understood it correctly, was also talking about like the ways that this type of a instructional approach or academic approach is implemented in our alternative schools. Was that fair? I will say that you know, I started in the district in July. It's been a busy year, and I have not had an opportunity. Through the fall and early winter, I think I've visited 65-ish schools. I have not had a chance yet to visit all of or many of the alternative schools. I will state that in collaboration with our community, with our principal corps, it's my understanding, just looking at, you know, I think SEL data and other really important metrics for our students, that we have to do a better job. And I think our model and philosophy and strategy here needs to be rethought in collaboration with community. And I'm eager to be able to sort of tackle that heading into next school year, because I think your question, inherent in your question, is a sort of idea around whether or not the same old thing is going to work for a group of students, and I think we know the answer to that question, but we can't be in a place. My leadership style is such that we can't be doing things to community, right? We have to do them in collaboration with community, and so I think there's just a framing here that I think is really important, and I'm eager to get tackling that work with them.
So this is the area that I love because I have done a lot of Paulo Freire's theory of radical education, as well as education to liberate, and I think some of those practices and really sort of thinking about the collective and the community and communal practices in education, as well as that critical consciousness that students need to build. I think that we have really great materials and that we need to also advance them in terms of the enabling text, which connects back to Dr. Tatum's work, which is part of our equitable literacy work that really is centering.
Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Huh?
Dr. Beverly Tatum, is that?
Oh, no, Alfred Tatum, excuse me, yes.
Okay.
And so we have been working with Dr. Alfred Tatum in his approach around enabling texts, and those are the texts that really connect to student identity, community, and as well as interests. And so with really sort of developing that framework in terms of equitable literacy, our goal is to ensure that schools, aside from also alternative schools, that are especially our pilot schools, innovation schools, and other schools that might be have more flexibility in terms of curriculum, that we have a sense of guidance in working with them, so there will be an approach.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you because I know I'm about to run out of time, but specifically, you know, what we see in BPS is that the schools that are identified as being high performing have a specific amount of financial resources attached to them. They can have this many AP classes, extracurricular activities, and so more so in that vein, how do you feel the budget is investing? You know, I think a lot of people are, oh, you know, we've continued to have this conversation that we're spending too much money at BPS, but if we were, then BLS wouldn't need a $60 million endowment. So how do in terms of the curriculum and the academic excellence, how do you feel like our budget is faring in terms of investing in the, you know, being able to deliver the curriculum and have the outcomes that we want for our young people?
You want to take that first, or you want me to?
I think just a couple clarifying pieces on that in terms of the investments aligned to some of this. The first is, I mentioned earlier this morning, there's an investment in Mass Core at the high school level to invest in rigorous access to coursework. That's starting in the 9th grade for next school year to give students more access to Mass Core curriculum. Also includes 9th grade guidance counselors to be able to support students in accessing that coursework. Other academic investments that they may want to highlight even more, ESSER includes over years 2 and 3, $3 million in ethnic studies programming, and then $13 million over the 3 years of ESSER in equitable literacy. So that's intentionally going to ensure professional learning and training for educators, high-quality instructional materials, and implementation support. So it's not just about buying new materials and leaving educators on their own, but really making sure there's high-quality implementation of this new framework.
Thank you. No further questions, Madam.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia?
This is one that I think one afternoon for all of these topics is just unjust, because there's just so much to cover here. So we'll be here until tomorrow, just so you know. But no, I'm really excited and grateful. And I always defer to Councilor Ladas for her just bringing that sense of honesty and ease and accountability into the space, because we do expect BPS to work miracles with mayonnaise, and that's not. Well, we're here also to hold you accountable, so here are my questions. We appreciate it. You ready for it? Yeah. Okay, I have questions. So I'm curious if we could just start off. Can you tell me specifically how you all are planning to address the McKinley schools? 4 schools specifically with that has, you know, students with disabilities, but they don't have a gym or library, or cafeteria. Yeah, can you talk to me about that real quick?
Yeah, I don't know about real quick, but I can talk to you about it.
No, but you're going to talk to me real quick, right?
I'm going to talk to you real quick. Yeah, you tell me, just interrupt me if I'm going for time. I know. Let me say this. I've had an opportunity to visit the McKinley twice. I'm very clear that something needs to change.
Okay.
The superintendent is very clear that something needs to change. I've had opportunities to speak not only to educators there, but also to community members who share that feeling. I think there's some opportunities for strength there, and we need to sort of leverage that. But you know, I think the superintendent's decision to go ahead.
Are we going to invest in McKinley schools? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How much are we going to invest in them?
I can't answer that question
Okay.
right now.
Okay, then I'm moving on. You are hiring, I think you said 30 reading interventions?
I believe that's the number.
30?
Yeah.
But 20?
20.
And that's just for the transformational schools.
That's the transformational schools.
So what happens to the other schools?
So I'm sorry. It's not just 20 positions. There's 20 additional positions plus the ones that we already
But we have
have.
125 schools.
Yes,
So-
and I have a list of every educator who has certified to be an Orton Gillingham or Wilson trained educator. And so we have a number of resources across our system that are prepared to deliver resources for students who need those reading interventions.
Okay, so let's talk about reading interventions. Can you just talk to me a little bit about who on your team has tried and true literacy expertise, not just in ELA?
Yeah.
And, you know, students who are struggling with reading, there is no joy, right, when they're struggling. Mm-hmm. And if they are struggling with reading, it's going to be really hard for them to have a love of learning. So who on your team is the expert?
Yeah, we have multiple people on the team who have expertise in literacy. Some people at early childhood grades, other people at secondary levels. We've also posted for next year a number of positions to lead our equitable literacy work, and we'll be hiring people who have deep literacy expertise to lead those initiatives.
Awesome. And, you know, last year we filed and passed an ordinance to create a literacy task force here in the city of Boston, because the last time we measured literacy rates was in 2003. And I'm just curious whether or not the administration has reached out to you all to engage you in that process.
The administration?
The people who work in this building, the mayor's people, the administration, that's how I thought.
I'm not sure, I don't know.
You don't know?
Yeah.
Okay. on the record, you have not been reached out to, okay?
Yes.
Just
On the record.
Okay. So then let me just go to some questions around English language learners. You know, oftentimes we pair English language learners and students with disabilities. You talked about the fact that we have students who are this, that, or the other, but sometimes they're all of those things, right? So can you just talk to me a little bit about what your coordination looks like when we have students who fall in multiple buckets, and what that coordination looks like quickly, because I have one more question before I get buzzed.
Sure. So for our English language learners, multilingual learners, we have a weekly meeting with our Office of Special Education. So we have an executive director, Faye Karp, who has been doing tremendous work and actually has been at the office for about 10 years. So we work closely together. We collaborate with the Office of Special Education, as well as youth opportunities. So we are trying to really move and break down the silos, if you will, the institutional silos, and sometimes it's unintentional in terms of all of the buckets and work that people have going on. Part of the MTSS, the multi-tiered system of support work, is to be able to really ensure that there's a collaborative effort so that our students are at the center, so that when they when we are engaging in a policy, for example, or a shift or programmatic analysis, that we are working across the department.
Awesome, I'm encouraged to hear that. I always say we're resource rich, but coordination poor. And then I have one more question before my buzzer goes off. This is, I forget who it was here, but they talked about some investment, 5 million in addition to English language learners, but you really didn't talk about the 120 million. Like, what's your plan in terms of transitioning the total system from English immersion to access to native language? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
The 120 million that the counselor is referring to is the total program budget for English learners across the district. So it includes core teaching, as well as the central office staff and contracts for support.
And so we also included in that the Title I as well as Title III. The additional 5 million is to reshift the focus, so implement the Look Act and bilingual education programming. Part of that is, unfortunately, I've had to restructure the office in my interim role since January. So we have new positions that we've created that are multilingual instructional coaches, 6 of which are bilingual. Additionally, we're hiring an executive director and a director to lead that work. So our strategy is also working with family specialists, so that we are working with our school communities, so that is educators, families, school principals. So we're looking at the programs in which we have language-specific SEI programs, for example, as well as the high percentage of that language, dominant language, in addition to the staffing, the language capacity and the linguistic abilities of staff, to ensure that we're not doing onto schools, again, as you mentioned, and really working with them.
Thank you. Councilor Lujan, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I'm going to continue on this line of questioning because it's taken some time under the Look Act, to get that implementation of native language instruction. And so hopefully, with your leadership, it sounds like we're really trying to accelerate that, and that's encouraging to hear. Can you just walk me through what a classroom looks like for an English language learner who's also a student with a disability? Because I want to know what that classroom, what a day looks like in terms of resources, paraprofessionals. Just walk us through what a day in a classroom should look like and what the ultimate goal would be. And I know it's going to vary by student, because I think we're talking about 4,000 students, right? When we're talking about around that, right? English language learners who also, and so based on the chart that we saw earlier, I didn't know what the percentage is. With English language learners, we get an 18% on top of the baseline, and then I'm not sure what it is for students with disabilities, but what does that look like in a classroom right now, and with full implementation of the Look Act, what is that going to look like?
Great question. So, I will have to admit that the settings and the program and placement is an area of great concern in terms of our equity and access for students who are dually identified. We have started a review process or a methodology, so that we are also trying to engage in research and a review of our our assignment process, because you have students, obviously, who are dually identified, so they may have access to, let's say, an SCI Spanish program, for example, versus a separate. That all has to do with their language as well as disability. So we want to make sure that when we transition to offering bilingual support in students across the system, not just in special education, we also have the same case happening for students in dual language schools and dual language programs, in which they're not necessarily structured or set up to actually support the disability that students have when they're diagnosed. And so we're looking at across the system between the special education placement and programs as well as the English learner programs. We have about 3 programs that are SCI language specific and also inclusion, and so we're working with the Department of Justice. One thing I should mention is that all of our programming has to meet the Department of Justice requirements and the Department of Education, so we have a very thorough process, if you will. So the Look Act implementation, we're working with the state to really redefine what that means for us as a district with our SCI programming, especially with the language-specific programming. One of the challenges with the language-specific programs is that you can have a Spanish strand. It does not require the teachers or educators to have Spanish as a prerequisite or required in that setting, right?
That's for a sheltered immersion.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And let me just expand, because a lot of acronyms in our field. So SCI is the Sheltered English Immersion, which is the state, which after the 2003, when we did away with transitional bilingual education and the UNS initiative, what it did was really harm the district. It harmed families, it harmed educators. There were teachers, including myself when I was a director, who said, I'm afraid to speak in Spanish. And I was like, no, you can absolutely speak in Spanish to that student. But the state in that revision after that law, when it passed, said that all students needed to acquire English in 1 year, and that we will no longer use a native language. And so what we have to also do is we have to deal with the belief system that adults have in our district. Yep. That includes principals, it includes us as a district, it includes educators, paraprofessionals. If we do not create the belief that language is an asset and that we absolutely need to create the structure and a system in a pathway, but part of that is also training, educative materials, and ensuring that we're working with our families and really elevating their voice in this process, that we should be valuing in the additive language that our students bring.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's spot on. And I think, Ms. Jacobson, you were talking about this too, right? The way that we talk about our students, and I will always be the one that say when we talk about our English language learners, it's an asset. And we need to be able to talk about, even of our students who learn differently, right? How do we look at all of this as an asset? Related to something that Counselor Fernando Anderson, I believe, mentioned, and we've been talking about it a bit, is with this transition to native language instruction, we're going to need a more diverse set of teachers, right? Who can actually have that ability to speak the languages that we find in our Boston Public Schools. And that will also mean more Black and Brown teachers, something that we struggle with when it comes of both attraction, which we've been doing better at, but retention. So I wonder what the plan is there. And relatedly, if folks could speak to the barriers that credentialing will create and will create, especially in this native language front. How can we be thinking differently about the credentials that we require that create barriers for teachers of color, educators of color who want to enter the game?
Thank you. And I just will have to honor my dear mentor, Carmen Torres, who transitioned this week, who had worked in the Office of English Learners and was the co-founding principal and headmaster for Boston Arts Academy in Fenway. And she was my mentor. She was my Puerto Rican madre, who really grounded me when it got tough in the district when I worked at the Office of English Learners and years throughout. So we have to do better in creating mentorship and opportunities for our educators who are linguistically and racially diverse. There's certainly a feeling of sometimes feeling isolated, alone, or that you're sort of fighting for students and families that doesn't necessarily feel that it's supportive in the school community or that the system is responsive to the students and families. So I think there needs to be an intentional system, aside from the racist right? So the pedagogical approaches that we have in testing, and that it does prevent many of our highly qualified, you see some of these educators in their classrooms and they are phenomenal. And yet the struggle to pass an MTEL test is the barrier. And so we know that when we say racist, that it means that we have to move into an anti-racist framing of how do we really dissect that testing items and working with educators and coaching. Our Recruitment, Cultivation, Diversity Office does do a model in which they do provide in our bilingual endorsement support for the test itself in addition to coaching. And they've been able to really demonstrate that with the racial diversity. We are now working on creating a similar pathway so that we can actually focus on a linguistic diversity of educators and staff and growing that pipeline from within our community, from within our paraprofessionals and within our network.
If I just add one quick thing to this, I think the part of this, and I really appreciate the strategic questions that you're tackling here. Another part of our strategy is to identify particularly the language-specific sheltered English immersion classrooms. They tend to disproportionately have educators who speak the target language at the school, and their community is set up to make a transition toward a more native language instruction. So that's part of the strategy, in addition to some of the things that Farah just mentioned. Under Farah's leadership, I just also wanted to let the council know that I believe in May, I think late May is your presentation to the school committee, but we'll be bringing forward a strategic plan for the department as well as a policy document that's very actively shifting our practice for multilingual learners toward a more native language instruction, which we're really proud of.
There's just 1 second, I could just
Thank you.
add. Yes. That we are also working with Boston College, and I am working with them to create a bilingual leadership pathway. Because we do not have one in the state or as part of the requirements from the state as a bilingual ed endorsement. And we also have to develop and build our school leaders with bilingual education in order to make that shift.
Thank you, Ms. Ashraj. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilor Bach?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'll just say, I would second Councilor Mejia's questions about McKinley. I've got both the middle and the high school, and I was encouraged to see the $175,000 in the budget for a study there, but when we get to the capital hearing, would love to talk more about that, because we need a real commitment to those students, and that it bothers me a lot having those two campuses in my district. Can I just ask, on the literacy front, can you distinguish for me a little bit better this $5 million that we're doing in ESSER versus the 5.9 investment that's described elsewhere in the packet? Is it two separate investments, or is the $5 million for ESSER inside of the 5.9?
The 5, I think those are in addition, or those are overlapping.
Okay, so when it says 5.9 investment in equitable literacy, and then in the appendix there's 5 million out of ESSER, it's 5 million out of ESSER plus 900,000.
Yeah, sorry, just one more moment. Yes, yes.
Okay, so then I guess the question I have that I'm trying to understand on, and this is really going to some of the appendix stuff from the packet, is like, last year we were talking about adding a bunch of staff supports, thinking about our students returning and all the social and emotional support, and there was kind of a sense of like surge, and the reading stuff was a surge. But I think things like the reading interventionists you're talking about today, things like the librarians, I mean, I ticked down this list of things that we're putting ESSER funds into, and it's pretty obvious that they're capacities that the district is trying to build permanently. Like, we know from the literacy numbers that we need the reading interventionists, and it's not like because there was a pandemic, right? So what's the kind of plan to bridge from these pretty extensive staff commitments out of the ESSER, kind of looking forward to that sort of cliff that you guys have on the, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. When we look at the ESSER funding, there are two categories. The allocation that we made directly to schools, which is about $50 million per year to individual schools. As part of their proposal, schools are expected to come up with a sustainability plan that specifically was meant to address how they would transition post-ESSER back to their standard allocation. In the central office side, we did look at the categories of spending on central office, to think about it in a couple different categories. The first are those things that would likely require city funding. There's about $21 million per year on ESSER that are those types of positions that you're sort of flagging. It's 39 FTEs, including, and then K-8 academic counselors, athletics, recruitment and cultural diversity programs, those kind of things that we are investing in on ESSER as sort of a down payment on either future efficiencies or additional revenue. There's another $18 million on ESSER per year, approximately 71 FTEs, that are things that we may need to continue, but are primarily focused on recovery or pilot programs. So things that we will be monitoring and trying to determine if they have effective outcomes. This includes things like acceleration academies and additional nursing staff that was hired for COVID recovery. And then there's another $20 million per year, $20 million over the 3 years that are one-time costs that we've identified. Those things that are professional development for the startup cost of academic counselors, repairs to bleachers and weight rooms as part of the athletic investment, laptops and materials for social workers, those kind of things. So I do think that the future sort of plan around sustainability for ESSER has to do with either identifying additional revenue or for us to identify how we will start to sunset some of the soft landings that we talked about this morning, that 54 million, and through either additional closures, consolidations, or other ideas as we look for efficiencies as a district.
And can you talk to me about on the librarian side, just like a bit about kind of how are we figuring out what each school needs and what we can build out there? I mean, I think it's been distressing to all of us, the inequities in the library system.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll take it, and then you can build. One, I just want to appreciate the question. As it relates to our strategy around investing in libraries, we made very explicit a decision to ensure that our ESSER investments for librarians and libraries are those one-time costs. Okay. So books, updating the collections, getting the software to sort of check in the books, et cetera.
So the 5.7 that's on operating is more the permanent
It's
stuff.
there. The 5.7 that's on the operating is more the permanent investment in FTEs to support that work.
I guess what was panicking me is on the literacy front is that it's almost all on this ESSER thing, and so that's where I'm trying to, it doesn't feel like we've done the same.
It is certainly something that keeps me up at night. I think to Councilor Mejia's question around investments in the infrastructure, it was really important to us to ensure that we had the expertise that we needed at the central office to ensure that we could deliver on the work that we're promising relative to equitable literacy, and we knew that we needed to get this infrastructure started. Certainly was feedback that came to us through our community equity roundtable. And so we wanted to build that infrastructure knowing that we'll have to figure out an operating plan for that in the future.
Got it. And sorry, causing disaster over here.
This is why we don't have nice things.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, that sounds like my timer. I would just say that I'm thrilled about the Mass Core commitments. I think making sure that we've really got that across the board, and we've had several years now of sitting in these budget hearings and saying we're getting to the high schools and investments in the high schools next budget season, so it's good to see some movement there. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Arroyo, you have the floor.
Thank you. Spillageddon over here threw me off a little bit. Hold on, let me just. So a quick question on the amount of students. We talked about 30% are English second language learners. Just to dive into that a little bit more, do we know the breakdown of students by grade? So in other words, how many of that percentage are in what we would call the K through third grade group, and then the third through sixth grade, and then seventh through high school? Can we break those numbers down to that level? Do we know?
Yes, I can pull up the numbers as you ask other questions, but yeah, we have the breakdown. We break down all of our enrollment projections by grade and program and school. So we can slice that data up in many different ways to look at the enrollment. And One thing I'll just add as we go to it, we often look at the English learner data by language group and by neighborhood as a way to kind of understand how overall sort of trends are happening across those neighborhoods.
Okay, the reason I'm asking is obviously these are all different sort of and pivotal in their own ways, sort of periods of education, but it also helps me understand when you can pull these numbers up, whether or not we have, you know, if you have a third grade or a second or a first grade class, they eventually become a sixth and a seventh and eighth and so on and so forth. So it helps me understand what those patterns are showing. If we have a density of those numbers early, then we should be building sort of ramps, or if it's spread out evenly, then that sort of explains that too. But the question that I do have on this is we had talked earlier about the general classes that they take general course load as well. Do we know today what percentage of that 30% are focused solely on ESL classes or are taking sort of general language classes as well?
We have the first question.
Great.
So you're looking for specific data points. I want to make sure that I understand the question so that there's a lot of numbers and data charts. So if you could just please.
So let me be very clear. 30% of our BPS population are English second language learners. We talked about how much of the budget in our last hearing on Tuesday. How much of our budget was dedicated to English as second language learners? I think we got to like 11%, but there was then some pushback that they take general education classes as well. And then I followed up with what percentage of them are taking and how many general education classes are they taking. And there was some agreement that at this hearing we might be able to get some of those numbers. So that's what I'm looking for. How much overlap? Because when you have 30% of our student population as English second language learners, but only 11%, give or take, dedicated specifically to English as a second language, and the pushback is, well, they also take some of these general education classes. I'd like to know what that percentage is.
Yeah, I think so when we think about spending on English learners as a percentage of the budget, there is the 11% or the 120 million that we were talking about is the funding that is dedicated solely and exclusively for English language learner services. In addition, English learners benefit from transportation costs, which are not coded to English learners, athletics, administrative costs, facilities costs, all of those things that are cost.
Sort of wraparound, what I would consider wraparound services, right? Like I'm sure they also benefit from the heat and the fact that we keep the lights on. And
exactly.
So that's more so what I'm talking about is money towards programming specifically for educational programming. We could, obviously the arts and sort of teaching the whole child, I count that as well, but I'm talking about specifically academically. We got to about 11% of this budget goes towards that, right? So let me be more clear. It's not 11% of the total budget. It's 11% of the portion of this budget that is dedicated towards academics specifically.
For English learners.
Yes, that's what we got to, right? So
I can just share with you some numbers that sorry, I wanted to make sure I get to the right data set. So hopefully this answers the question and we can revisit. This school year 21-22, in terms of our English learners, total of students in Gen Ed are, this is just the ELD 1 to 3. So we calculate it differently by ELD 1 to 3 because those students are generally placed in an SCI, but we prefer and recommend they're in an SCI program. So we have more of an increase of students moving into Gen Ed due to their ELD 3 and transitioning out. And so right now, we're about 50% of ELD, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm saying that correctly. 50% of ELD 1 to 3 are in Gen Ed or special education. We have a large number of ELD 4 and 5, so just to make sure I calculate the total there. Okay, here we go, all grades, special ed.
All right, well, you get that together, which is fine.
Sorry, over 5,000 students are ELD 4 to 5. So I can just have a team member just kind of give the breakdown of the percentage of those numbers.
That'd be perfect. I'm going to shift. Again, my issue here is that probably what I've been led to believe in the 3 years that I've been here, which sort of bears out, is that much of our new matriculation into our schools is actually English second language learner students. With COVID, with travel policies and things that have changed, there's been some fluctuation there. But previous to that, that's where the crux of it comes from. Mm-hmm. In terms of succeeding here academically in this state, when the MCAS is an English-only test, is to my knowledge, it's an English-only test, correct? Most of our testing is. When we're talking about sort of what metrics other folks are using to define success and their own future success academically, it's incredibly important to me that they receive the resources that they need, especially when we've had decades of them not receiving what they need because of the UNS initiative, because of other things. And so where I'm at right now in terms of this budget is we can get into the academic stuff, and we probably will at some other point. We don't have enough time here. But when we talk about wraparound things like mental health supports, it's really important to me that they can get that in a language that they can actually benefit from. What do we have available to them right now? I know we did a big thing about social workers in every school and trying to make sure we had sort of school psychologists and things like that. How much of that is accessible to them in a real way because it's in the language that they speak?
So we do have an MTSS social, emotional, and mental health presentation on Monday. One of the questions that we'd asked or that we'll be sharing is the ratio of social workers per students, and the other will be a breakdown of the languages of social workers as well as behavioral health, so our school psychologists. And the languages, I know that we've increased the capacity of the languages and school psychologists. One of the critical areas that I'm working with, Office of Human Capital and others, Office of Special Education, again, a sort of a team approach is that we are working to ensure that we shift some of the requirements for positions for next year so that dual language and schools with programmatic sort of high language dominance, for example, in Spanish, are requiring that language. There are obviously some issues around meeting that with the workforce in addition to our BTU as well as other unions and working with them on that.
Okay, so I heard the buzzer, so I'll wait for the second round, but there'll be more questions on this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Braden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. One of my interests is in really support for special education students in terms of language acquisition at the early years. Some of these special education students come from their ELLs learners as well. So how do you approach, the early education of a student who English is not their family, the family language at home, and how do you scaffold language development at that early age in the complexity of an ELL context and also paired with a disability?
In the early childhood years, so
I think I'm focused on the early childhood because
Yes.
I think then that's where you build the foundation for future success, and if you start early, you build it up.
100%, and I was an early childhood read interventionist, and so a lot of my work actually started with multilingual students prior to referral and students with disabilities. And I can tell you that the intersection of language and language development as well as disability is very complex, as you know. And it's not often easy to tease out in the early grades as students' variability in early childhood really drastically could look different for some child who's at exactly 3 years old versus 3 years old and 9 months. Or, similarly to, the age span and around being 5 years old or 6 years old. So because of that, there has to be flexibility as well as a lot of small group and rotations, which most of our teachers and educators have been trained to do in early childhood. And as that language integration is also building on the oral language foundation. So if there is a second language, most of the students, when they enter the classroom, You might expect that there's a long time for wait response. Students are taking more time to process. They're really connecting their auditory and what they're hearing from what they're seeing. So they're matching it with what their home language is. One of the areas that we have to work on as part of our new vision with the Office of Multicultural Education is that bilingual pathway. So I have started meeting with the early childhood department. We are looking to create a biliteracy pathway for students in their native language to sort of see what is the scope of the language development, especially with literacy, sound systems. Those are the sort of the early elements of literacy that you need to kind of learn and then build on, as opposed to, here's how I sort of learn. So there's two things: simultaneous for a language acquisition, which happens from 0 to 3 ages. So students and children who are learning both those languages really thrive and master, at a much higher rate. And we see that in the cognitive development research across, across the ages, that it really carries those students, and they have the benefit of that cognitive ability and that metalinguistic awareness. So in order to really move towards this vision, we have to create those opportunities for our students to engage and also learn in a second language. There are particular classrooms that Early Childhood Office has engaged in partnering with, as well as CBOs, so community-based organizations. So for example, Viet Aid has a bilingual Vietnamese program, so students are learning Vietnamese. So that's really important that we continue to really cultivate and grow those programs, but also supporting the educators. So our early childhood has been supporting those educators in classrooms across the YMCA in partnership with the YMCA and the CBOs to train them using the focus curriculum. And part of that training is also around the foundations, which is that sort of, again, reading skills and some of those prerequisite skills that you really kind of need to be able to develop a great reader or reader in meeting the fluency that they need at that grade level.
And do you use like sign language or total communication approaches for some of the kids, depending on what their impairments are?
Well, we have our amazing Horace Mann School for the hard of hearing and deaf that is also a bilingual school in ASL. I don't think they get enough recognition, but they're an amazing asset to our school community because they also have students whose families speak Spanish at home, and their child is deaf and hard of hearing. So families don't always necessarily have the ASL language, and so students are learning to do both. And they also have parent classes in which parents can engage and also learn ASL themselves. So there are other sort of deaf and hard of hearing settings across the district, but I think that school in particular, we really need to sort of elevate the amazing work that they're doing and working with multicultural, multilingual families across the state, really, because they're also a day program and they provide those services in that school site from opportunities for the state.
Very good, thank you. Madam Chair, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, just have to stop this clock. I have a few questions. One, just to continue on the ELL. I know that certain students come in with a language need, and I really like what you said about asset, because I think that I'm someone who goes around and I say I'm a polyglot, and it just gets sort of like underseen, like, so what? But it's not so what. It's a big deal to speak 6 languages fluently. And so for all the kids out there who can do this, you're superstars. And so I wonder, though, there are students that perhaps it's not just language, right? And I know that this is a reality. What are we doing about students, not only with language needs, but also literacy needs, as well as coming in with 0 education and just being placed in ELL classes with 0 assessment, not understanding that it's not the language,
Right.
It's just that this child never went to school.
Absolutely. So I was a former SLIFE teacher. That means students with limited interrupted formal education. And I taught at Boston International Newcomers. I taught students who were also newcomers in that program. So that's sort of where my heart lies. I've taught ESL in elementary, but I do really feel that we have to be able to assess how well, right, we do our work as the district. It is based and measured on our most vulnerable students. And that's how we view it. And as SLIFE students in particular, Most of my students had undiagnosed disabilities. So, child, for example, at the age of 3 in Cabo Verde, started struggling with school. Families couldn't really sort of, get the services or the supports. So many students end up, sort of being home or, finding opportunities to work and so forth. When they arrive here, once they enter the welcome services, and they are also flagged because of the home language, based on our home language survey, to have an assessment. They then go to our newcomer assessment counseling center, and there's a battery of tests and assessment specialists in those languages, and so they assess them, and part of that is also an interview. So they ask the students and their families about their education journey, their years of learning, the gaps of learning. So we have a SLIFE program that serves students what we call high intensive literacy training. I should also mention we are also under the META consent decree at the Office of English Learners. So we do have a META consent that really sort of delineates our guidance around SLIFE programming. So HILT 1 is, majority of students have had probably very little educational experience, and HILT 2 might be a student who might have had 3 to 5 3 years of gaps of learning. So both are true. There is a language and literacy. So we absolutely teach reading skills. There are foundational skills that we have to develop. And then there's a scaffolding from grade level to really meet the needs of those students and push them up.
Thank you. You mentioned, I think, was it Eccleston, not Etchelson?
It doesn't matter.
Thank you,
Yes,
Councilor
yes, that's right. It's Eccleston.
You mentioned social-emotional intelligence in the curriculum, and I wonder how does that translate in the budget? Where is that, and what is that? How can I find that?
Maybe Nick can answer the question of where it's in the budget. I'm not sure about that, but do you mean like where there are investments, or like where specifically in the budget line?
Well, first I guess I want to learn about how are we implementing it in the curriculum, and then how are we investing in that?
Yeah. So the question, I'm sorry, just one more time, is about social emotional learning. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So our approach toward thinking about social emotional learning is that has to be embedded within the core academic content. Separate programs isolated from academic content on social emotional learning for a tier 1 approach is not something that we think sort of works for students. So all of the programs that we invest in, so for example, in expeditionary learning, which is our core literacy program, the tier 1 SEL work is built directly into that program. So that's part of the sort of assessment we go through when we're selecting the curriculum or the programs for our students. You'll see investments directly in through ESSER and other operating budget things around curriculum, and all of those curricular choices have SEL built into them at their core.
Would you say that your teachers are qualified at the present time to teach students socio-emotional in the curriculum?
Do I think our teachers are qualified at this time to do it? Yes, I think they're qualified to do it. I will acknowledge that the last 2 years have been really hard. Certainly this last year has been my most difficult year of my career, of trying to respond in real time to all the operational issues that COVID has brought, plus the sort of real-time trauma and concerns of our faculty and our educators and our families and our students. So I think that there are some challenges for sure, but I do think that we are providing high-quality professional learning. I'm really proud and would be happy to share a copy of all of the professional learning that we have already established for next year for our educators to ensure that they're able to, particularly in the area of literacy, have the tools and resources that they need to implement these programs well and to incorporate the SEL components of that into the curriculum.
You will include it in your professional development so your teachers can be ready
That's right.
to do it.
Yeah.
Can you explain to me what this department encompasses? BPS finance, is it just accountants and CFOs? Like what's in the BPS finance department?
The BPS Finance Department in the overall division includes 6 teams. The teams include the planning and analysis team that's responsible for all enrollment projections, the grants team and external funding team that handles all of our federal funding, the business services, which includes accounting, And our procurement, they do contracts and all of the requisitions. The budget team, which helps prioritize, the great team you'll see sitting up there, helps prioritize and work with schools. And we're developing an internal controls team to help improve our overall risk management internal controls. There's a number of things that are in the budget office, overall finance division budget, that includes the district-wide budgeting for benefits. So a large portion of our budget is actually all of the benefits that are paid out as a district. We also manage other central office spending, including transportation attendance for charter schools and safety attendance are in our budget. And then we manage, the other big portion of our budget is we are managing all of the reserves. So we hold in budget a number of reserves for in the fall when we get new students that we need to allocate resources for. We have the money to do that, and that's held in the finance division's budget.
So the FY23 proposed of $199,675,210. It's the largest sum in your budget. And I was just really curious because you guys must do a lot of hard work to have the largest sum in the budget above anything else, above elementary or high school or anything else. So you must, and then, sorry, I stand corrected, the K through 8 actually, but then that's 202 million and then, so I was just really curious because I didn't know like how many teams and, you know, employees and works and projects you guys do there.
Yeah, the largest portion of that budget is going to be the benefits that are held in the finance division in the business services office. And if you give me one moment, I can tell you the total budget for benefits that's held that includes that amount. So roughly 106 million of that has to do with employee benefits, just for
No problem.
across district-wide. It's not specifically spending. It's not accountants and budget managers. That's where we, as a district, budget overall for our benefits.
That's where you put your benefits?
That's correct.
Oh, I see. That makes sense. Thank you. So I don't know if you touched on this, but there's a, so you have a number per pupil that you, and how much is that again? 27, was it?
The $27,000 per pupil.
And then does that remain consistent? So we were just talking about ELL and then them transitioning to different programs. Does that remain consistent all the way through high school?
No, that amount per pupil is differentiated across grade levels, across programs, and across schools. And so we do have an Explore budget tool on our website. It's bostonpublicsschools.org/Explore budget. That allows you to see the per pupil amount by school and then broken down by type of spending. So you can see within a school how that allocation comes across. And so you're going to see a lot of differentiation based on how full the school is, how many students there are, what the needs of those students are. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that range of per pupil spending at a school.
And then if intervention is needed, then what happens? The budget remains the same?
If intervention is needed at a specific school or for an individual student or both?
Individual school or the student?
Yeah, so we do a number of different interventions in specific schools. The soft landings and hold harmless are one way to stabilize a school and intervene. That's not based on a per pupil amount. It's meant to stabilize and keep specific resources at a school. For individual students, there's multiple ways that a school could receive additional services if needed. The special education department manages a lot of our related services, occupational therapy, physical therapy, additional behavior supports. Those are not on individual school budgets. They're allocated out as resources.
Sounds like you'd need to like sort of monitor the progress of the child.
Yeah, individual schools do need to monitor the progress of the child, and then, you know, our allocation methodology is based on available data systems within BPS to try and maintain consistency. Our goal is that two students who have the same situation or sort of similarly situated in terms of need receive the same funding regardless of what school they're at. That's one of our ways of ensuring consistency across. Unfortunately,
You have one liaison, one social worker, maybe a psychologist per school?
the allocations for all of those are based on a minimum per school and based on enrollment metrics. So social workers will increase based on the number of students experiencing poverty in their school, and school psychologists were allocated based on a per pupil amount as well.
So who monitors the progress of the child?
Within an individual school?
Overall, yes.
Yes, if I could take that question. So it's more of an academic question. So at the individual school level, each school is required to have a student support team. They are monitoring, that team is collectively monitoring the progress of students, both from an academic and a social emotional sort of learning perspective. And if educators have concerns about progress that students are making, they would bring that case forward to the student support team to discuss it, to problem solve it, to figure out where interventions are needed. If additional resources are needed, that school principal would talk to the school superintendent, who would then work with the budget office or other resources to figure out how to respond to the individual needs of students.
Where is that data?
Which data?
All this monitoring.
Yeah, so do you want to talk a little bit about Panorama, or I can do it? We have a platform called Panorama, and it hosts all of our data from an academic and social and emotional learning perspective. And so our educators and on the student support team are able to look into this data to track the individual academic performance of students, as well as look at the SEL data from surveys and other things that a student might complete.
Is that how you determine how much money then to put into the budget? It doesn't inform your budget?
No, I mean, that level of data, individual student data, doesn't drive the allocations in that way. You know,
Thank you. It's okay.
Well, if I could, I wanted to mention two other processes that we have in place to ensure that we are responding to school needs. Schools throughout the budget process can request additional funding if they feel they're in a situation that is not, that is outside the scope of weighted student funding. And it was called, this year we called it the School Budget Review Committee. And it was a cross-functional team that included special education, English learners, our Office of Equity, and it was led by the finance team. And so what we did was we took individual requests from schools for additional funding, evaluated them on an equitable basis, and then applied that decision to all of their schools that were similarly situated. So what we wanted to do was make sure that it wasn't about just those who advocated or those who had influence, but we were really trying to identify trends across schools. And that's a great way to get feedback from our individual school communities that are saying, hey, there's an area of funding that is not covered. There's an area of student need that's not yet covered. And then we would respond to it. And we found a couple different areas this year that changed the way we funded schools based on feedback from school leaders.
Would you say that's preventative or reactionary?
Well, I think it's preventative because of how early in the process we're doing it. We're talking about funding schools for next school year based on feedback. So we start our process for funding schools next year in October.
But you've monitored the child's progress or decline.
This is a place where I think our funding system works on sort of projected student need and the trends that we see across the school.
Post-observation of a certain number of children, of students, right?
And based on historical trends for the way that those students will persist within our system. I think what they're doing at the school level and at the academic system level is responding to, in near time, how students are doing now to be able to deploy the resources that have been put in the budget to better meet the needs of students.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you. Sorry, you can keep going. I just wanted to make sure that the virtual people are getting on.
Yeah, the last thing I'll just add is if we get to the fall and we found out that our projections were wrong and we didn't, or that more students have showed up that we didn't anticipate, or there are increased needs of English learners or increased needs of special education, we have a strategic enrollment action team that can review those projections and fund schools and give schools more money in the fall to have resources. That is reactionary to the changing, but those reserves that we hold are intended to give us the financial flexibility to meet the needs of students as they arrive, and to make sure that we're not, sort of in a situation in the fall where a school is saying, I have 10 more English learners that I need more staff for, and we don't have the resources to deploy. We've planned for that eventuality because there's always this level of unpredictability about where students will enroll and in what numbers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and I'm closing because I've taken more than my time, and I'll yield my time for next. But I think to Councilor Lara's point, in terms of transformative pedagogy or just sort of curriculums that are more innovative, and looking at if we continue to do the same thing, but we're not looking at preventative measures in terms of tackling social determinants of health. And I understand you're not public health, you're schools, but that we are, when we talked about this yesterday, creating that synergy between resources and school, homeschool connections, right, all of that stuff. But we're always reacting to the result. And so we know what we're gonna get already. And I just wonder if we can start thinking about what Councilor Lara was saying in terms of transforming the system so that we are preparing before we actually have the issue. And at this point, like we're just reacting. We're just, okay, here's where the money's gonna go because this was where the problem. We're just reacting, right? And so I think that's what everyone is feeling here in terms of, there's a need, there's a supply, and then there's a demand. Mm-hmm. And then if we continue to do that, that's prison pipeline, right? There's a supply and there's a demand, more prisons, more arrests, more diagnosis, more treatment, more social workers. How many Black and brown children do we diagnose with these social workers in the schools? When do we go into services without a diagnosis so that we can assess situations that are situational, circumstantial, without actually labeling and putting medication and all that stuff to a child if not necessary? But in order for the insurance companies and all those third-party companies that you're bringing into the schools, in order for them to bill them, they have to diagnose these children. They have to put a label to them. And so when we see the problem, we say they need social workers, they need mental health, and then we react, and then diagnosis, and we create this prison pipeline, and we're not really addressing it. All we're doing is reacting, and because insurance has to pay for it, they have to get a diagnosis. We're just labeling a whole bunch of Black and brown children over and over and over, instead of putting our resources in curbing the social determinants of health as preventative measures in order for us to really give them the basis that they need to set them up for academic success. We're gonna go to our virtual testimony, and then we'll come back for second round. Ms. Sharon Hinton, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Ms. Hinton, welcome, and you have 2 to 3 minutes to testify. Please state your name and your residence and or affiliation, and you have the floor.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm Sharon Hinton, Hyde Park, educator, activist, president and founder of Black Teachers Matter. So I have a couple of things to say. Thank you so much for having this hearing. Thank you, Suraj, for demystifying the acronyms for those people who are not familiar with what these mean, because there are parents and not necessarily students right now, but people who are not involved in this who need to know that. And I also appreciate the cadre of counselors that are focused in advocating for teachers and parents and students and asking these demanding questions and accountability and transparency through this budgeting and the policies and priorities. So here come the questions. DESE receivership is like the sword of Damocles, threatening to derail all this wonderful work. So I'm wondering if there is something that can be done, even if it resorts to legal measures that stop them from taking over, because this is great, but if they come in, they have their own agenda. That's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of private fundraising by several different schools that are BPS schools, are there policies and procedures, guidelines that you guys are looking at that are guardrails for a school that has $64 million in endowment and still gets funding from BPS? Is there something in line for that? In addition, recruitment and retention of teachers of color. This year, we lost 10 principals. Next year, potentially, we'll lose 30 principals, and that is another disruption in leadership. Is there something that's in place for that to stabilize the leadership? City councilors, are you guys possibly pushing for pilot funding and making them more responsible? Because that's some more money right there. Tens of millions of dollars that are payment in lieu of taxes, and they haven't paid it. So and looking at the funding formula also, which was an issue and it's been there for several years. Initially, it was being pushed by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz, who's now running for governor, but I think that gets stalled in the legislature. So I'm wondering if you guys are possibly thinking about revisiting that. And last but not least, technical vocational education. At what point are we really going to make that a priority? Are we going to start at the earlier grades, literally in elementary school, so that by middle school, kids are deciding if they want to be in debt in college, which may not necessarily give them the results they want in higher education, and they can get a perfectly good middle-class job, support their families, stay out of debt, and make some money. And I'm watching Madison Park also still take a back burner because it seems like every administration talks about it, and it doesn't happen. Thank you so much for listening, and keep up with the good work.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hinton, for your wonderful questions and comments. We look forward to responding. Perhaps if you'd like to come in and meet with us or have further discussion on this.
Would love to.
Thank you, Ms. Hinton. Have a good day. We have Danielle Ryan Tierney. All right, Ms. Tierney is not with us. Maybe she'll return. Thank you so much.
Attorney Goldberg.
We are going to move on to our second round. Councilor Murphy, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I do understand that this is a big topic, and I know my colleague did mention there's 14 topics under this one meeting, so there's so many, all of them important, and wish we could have a hearing for each one, but I know we can't. So I would love to use all of my minutes for you. Hopefully, Drew, you could start to talk about Madison Park High. I would love to talk about all of them. They all matter, but that's something I know. I don't need to waste any minutes on how I feel about it. I would love you to talk about it.
I'm really honored that the superintendent asked me to serve on the intervention team at Madison Park, so I've been working with the educators there. There's a few, listen, from my perspective, the outcomes and the opportunities that are afforded there are not where they need to be. I think there's some exemplary work that's happening in individual pockets at the school, but at a systems level, it's not acceptable. Let me say the following things based on some of the observations that I've made at the school, and I was just there with a faculty meeting of about 140 educators talking to them just earlier this week, it's all a little blurry. And there's several issues that I think need that the faculty and the way the meeting worked is that the BTU members and the faculty were in one room and the administration was in a different room, and they were talking about what were some of the issues that were facing the school. It was virtually an identical conversation, which I thought was like really interesting from a data perspective. Some of these issues that they identify is there's a lack of integration between the traditional academic content and the career technical education programming. That needs to be integrated in a much more thoughtful way. The programming around the exploratory work for students, I think, needs to be strengthened. So what's happening right now, at least the way that the teachers and the staff report it, is a lot of students are selecting the school. They don't even know that they're getting there and that they're going to a career technical education school. And that's a really intentional strategic decision that a student and family might make, and we want to ensure that not only do families and students know that that's what they're going to, but that that's something that they're really passionate about, and they have some idea of what they might want to explore when they get there. So I think we know that as we start to think about the transition from 7 to 12, and then also think about grade 9, that there are really strong exploratory programs for our students. And then what I heard really with a level of honesty from the educators and from the administrators is that, for some of the teachers in what they call the hard chops, this might mean like sort of carpentry or something like that, that those folks have a set of knowledge and skills relative to that work, but they haven't necessarily been trained as teachers, right? And so there has to be far more, I think, support for particularly new teachers as they start to think about making a transition from our career that's separate from education into teaching that as part of their sort of major profession. And I think, I think the people may disagree with me. I think the school has a pretty robust budget, and I think we have to have some hard conversations around whether or not the investments that we're making, to the point that's been brought up a few times by a few counselors, are actually leading to the return on investment that we expect for our students, and how do we stop doing things that aren't working and invest in things that we know do work. And that's a conversation that I know the intervention team is really excited to have. I'm honored to be working with the educators that are like top notch. It's one of my favorite meetings of the week. I'm actually not there right now because they're meeting from 3:30 to 6 because we're here, but they're now unpacking all of this data that sort of has come forward, and then Monica and her team at ODA have prepared data packets for the intervention team, and we're moving forward with some recommendations. Last comment about this is I lead from a position where we have to stop doing things to community. And my interpretation of some of the things that have happened in the past relative to Madison Park is a bunch of external people who don't either know the Boston context or know the school come in and make some recommendations about what the community should do. And then we're surprised that the plan sits on a shelf and that no one implements it, right? And what I hope is different as it relates to Madison Park for this new year, and I'm really excited about some of the momentum, is that the work that we're doing, I hope, is inspired by the people who are there every day. And I hope that in collaboration with the educators, with our union partners, and with others, that we'll get to a set of recommendations that I think hope will not only make the school community proud, but the entire city of Boston.
Has there been any conversation about removing it from BTU and out of the BPS system? Having it more like other vocational schools across the state as a regional school?
We haven't gotten to the point of problem solving yet, so we haven't gotten to the point of making recommendations, but I have not heard something like that. I've heard that externally, but not
in your conversations yet. Thank you.
Yep.
Councilor Lara, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. A couple of things. One, all my following questions are around special needs, and I want to ask them all together because I'm not going to be here for a third round because I have to get my kid off the school bus. One, I want to thank you for invoking Carmen Torres's name here today. She was not only an incredible educator and had such a big impact on the BPS system, but she was also my aunt, and it's been a loss for our family, so thank you. So special needs, I'm going to ask them all and then you can answer them. So our special education students, specifically, inclusion students, the ones who are in sub-separate classrooms, they need accommodations, which include kind of adaptive materials and other therapeutic supplies. Do you have a breakdown of the special education equipment spending specifically? And do you feel like the budget that you have now really addresses the need? I'm using this as an example. My kid has sensory processing disorder, and he uses a sensory necklace. He takes it to school. I sometimes forget because I'm a single parent and my brain is somewhere else. And the other day he came home with a makeshift sensory. They had like a necklace and they use like a little zip tie. And I was like, why don't they have necklaces at the school? Why do they have to make this? And so, if you were to ask an occupational therapist, what would they say about their ability at BPS to kind of provide the materials for the students in these classrooms? My second question is about weighted student funding. I know that we ensure that students that have differing needs get what they need. but it looks like it's decreasing by 26 million. And I know that we are increasing our overall spending by 22 million, but it doesn't necessarily close the gap. So can you talk a little bit about that loss? I would assume that, especially after the pandemic, we have more needs and not less. And then my final question is about the inclusion staffing model. Can you talk a little bit about the different inclusion staffing models and how BPS is thinking about this quality guarantee when it comes to inclusion classroom staffing? I know that we've seen a lot of reports of just inequitable staffing across schools, and I know that you can't speak about the current contract negotiations with BTU, but I know that we're also having that conversation about classroom ratio, so I'm curious about that.
I'll take the question first because I think it's the most straightforward. The decrease in weighted student funding and the increase in hold harmless are correlated. And so that's part of why you see such an increase in hold harmless costs, because those are costs that would have been paid for out of weighted student funding. The reason that you don't see a straight correlation between the two is because we have 3 closed schools. And so the Timilty, the Irving, and the Jackson Man schools were all schools that received weighted student funding allocations in this current fiscal year that will not receive allocations. Some of that has gone to reinvesting in other schools in their weighted student funding, and some of it we're waiting to see where those students enroll as we expand 7th and 8th grades at the English, the Burke, and Brighton High School. So that's where you see on the per student funding. And then we are seeing fewer students with disabilities as part of the enrollment decline. And so that's another piece of it as well. And so as we see declines across the district, there are declines in English learners and special education that has to do with just overall percentage decreases. And then for the other 2 questions, I think I'll defer to this team and can follow up.
The first one is a really interesting question, and I don't know the answer to it, but I'm curious to know, and so I'd be committed to investigating what the investments are for those sorts of materials that are related to accommodations and be able to provide that information to you. On the third question, we have various different sort of inclusion models in the system. I will say this, start to just frame this. I think that sometimes in the BPS we frame this question in the wrong way. We've designed a system for our students with disabilities that all too often assumes that all students in a certain category or the certain profile need the same thing. And I think that is antithetical to what special education is supposed to be, which is that it's supposed to be this customized, specialized program for individual students. And so I sort of reject this notion that every inclusion classroom needs to look exactly the same way, because for some students, they're going to be in inclusion environments that are sort of more highly resourced and supported. And for other students with disabilities, they will not need that level of service, and that level of service might actually be a hindrance for them to become more independent in their work. I appreciate you also sort of acknowledging the state that we're in relative to contract negotiations, and certainly without revealing anything, I will say that I feel really confident that the BTU and the district are in the same spot relative to, we understand that this is something that needs to be fundamentally changed, and we will roll up our sleeves to do this work. There are differences of opinion about how to do that work, and I'm really committed to working with our BTU partners to get to a place that that makes sense for our educators, but most importantly, is customized to the individual needs of our students. And I don't think we're there yet as a system.
Thank you, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all. I have to leave, but I would love to see those numbers in terms of knowing that, you know, they're different based on school or need, but if you have them.
Should I send that directly to you or to the chair?
To the chair,
Okay,
please.
great, awesome,
Yeah.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia, you have the floor.
Thank you. There's so much. But we will get through this. I just kind of want to go a little bit deeper into some of the questions that Councilor Lara had in regards to services. You know, we hear from a lot of parents who are incredibly frustrated because they have not been able to get their IEP needs met. And I'm just curious, kind of like, what are we doing to build better infrastructure so that when a student is identified, a plan is created, what's the accountability in terms of the execution of those services?
Yep, I'll start, and I think that is a real disappointment in our system right now, right? I think too many students and too many families go too long to wait for, when an assessment is finished, to wait for the development of their IEP, to get things signed off. And as the Deputy Superintendent of Academics, I need to take accountability that we're not where we need to be relative to compliance issues. There are three sort of compliance issues that I see that are problematic that we're developing a plan for, and we're be submitting that to the school committee in the coming month. The first one is about the sort of annual evaluations that happen for students. We're behind on those. I think we were at a fairly decent point before COVID and have gotten in a really problematic space. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, just because I know my time is gonna go off.
Okay.
And that
Yeah,
gives me anxiety.
please.
So let's just, you don't have to go, is there a plan in place to improve the situation, yes or no?
It's in development. It'll be made public within the month. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because I definitely want to get through the rest of these questions. I'm curious if you could talk to me a little bit about, I've heard from some folks, and I've also seen it for myself, there are a lot of people, I'm going to talk specifically around the special education department. Just kind of talk to me about the diversity of your leadership in that space. More specifically, how many people who are Black or Hispanic?
The racial and ethnic diversity of the senior leadership team in special education does not represent in any way the rich diversity of our city and needs to be addressed.
Right, we know that. That's why I'm asking the question. But so the follow-up to that then is we've also heard from folks who have experienced this is that there have been folks who have applied for promotional opportunities to go up the ladder who have been people of color, and they have been passed up for their white counterparts who end up then being trained by the folks who had far more experience than them. So can you talk to me a little bit about what are we going to do to rectify that?
Within the next few months, under the new superintendent, we will be placing a posting for the assistant superintendent for the Office of Special Education. This will be obviously the next superintendent selection. And I'm committed as the Deputy Superintendent of Academics to ensure that that person represents the racial and ethnic diversity of our community. And we need to make sure that that is not only in that position, but also in the upper ranks of the special education department, because there's real consequences for decisions that get made.
Absolutely. And Nate, I'm just curious if you could just tell me kind of what is the pupil expenditure for students at the McKinley? What's the per pupil?
I'll need just one moment to pull it up if you want to ask your next question.
Thank you. You're so good. Thank you.
I'm learning.
What is the plan? I'm just curious, and I'm not sure who would answer this, but what is the plan for literacy and hiring someone who is a leader in the literacy space, and to build infrastructure for academic supports for all Boston Public School students, especially those who are English language learners and students with disabilities? Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, we earlier this year, a few months into it, maybe my tenure, maybe like August, September, we presented to the Community Equity Roundtable our plans for implementing literacy. And the feedback from community members was swift and clear. You don't have the infrastructure to pull this off. And so we've been building up the infrastructure to respond to that. We have multiple senior level positions that are posted, and we'll be recruiting people both external and internal to the system to address that.
Thank you. And then one more operational question, but this is for Farah. I'm just curious, we need an operational plan for the transition from English Immersion to, and I'm just curious, is there a plan in writing with where's the plan? Where are we in that process? Is there something that we can see? Because, we should have had this a long time ago under the Look Act, so I'm just curious about where we stand with that. Is there something that we can look at? Is there a plan written out?
Yes, so we've had multiple plans. Unfortunately, it's the sort of sustainability as well as the matching of the Look Act. So we worked with our task force, English Learner Task Force members. And I have to be honest, as a former member myself, we advocated for the Look Act as well as MATSOL. We are nowhere where we need to be. We have implemented, for example, the Mather Vietnamese Dual Language Program, the Josiah Quincy Chinese Enhanced Program. Obviously the ASL, as I mentioned, the Horace Mann School, but in terms of our plan right now, it's in the works. It would be presented to English Learner Task Force, but it will not sort of have all of the details built out because we're still in this phase of building out the infrastructure, and that's a crucial piece and element to this work. One of the areas that I think I also mentioned is that we are all of our programming is guarded by the Department of Justice and Department of Education. So our plan would have to be reviewed by them prior to going public.
Okay, great, thank you. How am I doing, Madam Chair? Could I get one more question, or are you good? Go ahead.
And I have an answer just quickly on the McKinley per pupil funding for FY23 is projected to be $98,513 per pupil, which includes the allocated out central office costs as well.
Okay, I'm curious, as we begin to talk about next level stuff, I'm curious if you could just tell me, why is it that oftentimes what I've seen is most of our kids of color who need, when it comes to out-of-placement, district out-of-placements usually are white that get these out-of-placement opportunities, and most students of color don't. They end up more in different types of classroom settings. Can you talk to me a little bit about how families are navigating getting that type of assistance? Like, how much is it, like $50,000 for out-of-district placement per pupil?
What's the average?
What's the average?
I'll need a minute for that.
Okay, because the reason why I'm asking is we're spending a lot of money for out-of-placement, right? And oftentimes the people who are taking advantage of that, or who are able to successfully do so because they have lawyers and they have the resources to fight the district and win that battle. And then oftentimes those who have least resources are unable to do so. So I'm just curious, what are we doing to help close that gap?
I just want to be clear, close the gap between students who have access to out-of-district placements versus those that do not? Is that a question? So it's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it in that context because my orientation has always been like, what do we need to do to ensure that our students have access to the general education curriculum in their own community? And I'd be really interested, given this sort of spirit of your question, to go back and to interrogate the data around the inequities that might be happening on the other end. Like, I get it, right? For some kids, you need an out-of-district placement. That's not all students, though, right? And so I think, I've been assuming that the team process would work itself out, but maybe that's not happening.
Right, so the reason why I'm asking this is because, we, the McKinley, the Madison, I mean, all the schools are my babies, but the McKinley, I talk about often, that particular school has an opportunity to really be transformative, right? And it doesn't seem to, in terms of resources, if we were, instead of sending students for out of placement and spending $50,000 to put our students into different spaces, why aren't we investing in improving the quality of instruction and care and design at a school like the McKinley?
I can't answer that question historically. However, I will tell you that it is a top priority for me moving forward, and people can hold me accountable for that. I'll be working with the team to ensure that we're moving toward improving the academic opportunities at the McKinley moving forward. I've received an enormous amount of feedback from the community. I've observed with my own two eyes and know that we have work to do with that community to ramp up instructional opportunities for students there.
And how are we using ESSER money that's going to our schools to promote innovation in programs for English language learners? I haven't heard the buzzer. Is there a buzzer now?
I just
got
let
it.
you go, but last question?
So I'm like a
Before-
little mouse, like once you start doing something that I expect that to be done, so when I hear other things, I don't know what happens, so
I can do that. I
I'm
can
trained
do that.
to
That was, all right. That was 5 minutes ago, but go ahead.
Okay, no, that's
Last
fine.
question?
I can wait for my third round.
I would just add that you asked that question on the out-of-district tuition cost. The average cost for out-of-district tuition is $100,000. That doesn't include the transportation costs for students. And then it's just important to note that that is a range of services for out-of-district. So there, of course, are some students that are in more expensive programs and some that are slightly less.
And I'd like to know at some point who's taking advantage of that and who's not. And I'll wait my next round.
Thank you. Councilor Jen?
I'm going to actually piggyback off of that, because so $100,000 per student for out-of-district education. How many do we have a year? I want to know.
470 students are out of district.
470.
Yep, 470.
That's expensive. Okay, my 3 questions. One, Madison Park. I felt sort of gutted when Counselor Murphy asked a question, and just because the conversation around Madison Park, right, it feels like folks have been talking about it forever, and the response was, we don't have a plan yet, we're thinking about it, and it just does not seem like the right, and I get it, but these are not this is not the first time that anyone has asked these questions, and tomorrow we're having a hearing on the Boston residents' job policy. And something that comes up again and again is that people say that we need a true vocational school. And I'm like, well, we have Madison Park. So I guess a question there is, what is the vision for really, creating a really robust vocational education school? Some people say that we should turn it into an admissions-based school, right? I think there are equity problems there. But if we're talking about making sure that you get folks into the school who are from the Boston area, a BPS school. If you could talk a little bit about that, like what are those? I just need a bit more than we're thinking about it. I want to know what we're thinking about to really make that more robust.
Yeah, and I don't want to disappoint you in any way, so I'll do my best to answer the question, but continue to push if you're not getting what you're looking for. Let me just say, just to clarify one thing that I said. I think it's still consistent with your spirit, but of what you're saying, but it's not that there haven't been plans. There have been a lot of plans, right? But they haven't been implemented in the way, and I have a whole host of theories as to sort of why that's the case. But you talk to the educators there, you talk to the communities, they can rattle them all off.
Yeah,
right,
a bunch of us went there a few weeks ago.
And I'm sure that if you had a chance to talk to educators, they would sort of would have told you. So I think that's obviously sort of part of the problem. I think some of the issues that you're sort of uncovering and asking about whether or not there should be admissions criteria, those are real conversations that we'll be having as an intervention team. And I'm sensitive to the fact that these decisions have impact from an equity perspective. And that's why under Dr. Granson's leadership, we have put the racial equity planning tool at the center of the work that we're doing around these intervention teams. So our plan, the plan that we're going to develop and make recommendations to the superintendent is due to the superintendent by mid-June. So I'll be in a place where we can certainly have community conversations, or I can come back and talk about the specifics, but it's due to the superintendent for her to accept or reject those recommendations by mid-June.
Okay, great. And it's good to have a timeline too, just because I just feel like we've been waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting, and I want to stop waiting, and students there and a lot of folks want to stop waiting. 2 is the question on libraries. I went to the Taylor and Mattapan, and I was there a few weeks ago, and I really love Ms. Asaraj, am I saying the last name right? That you mentioned SLIFE, because I got an opportunity to take a look at the SLIFE program there. My cousin is in a sheltered immersion classroom. And something that was really interesting and unfortunate is that there are a bunch of students in one of the sheltered immersion classrooms that are coming all the way from Brighton to Mattapan to get that SEI classroom because there's nothing available. I think I love folks coming to Mattapan, but I think that's a problem, that we don't have more seats available closer to their home, right? And it's great because it adds diversity and language diversity, which is an asset again to the school environment, but just wanted to flag that. But I really do think that the SLIFE model is I just want to elevate that, that it is a great model, and that I hope that we continue to build on that. Excuse me?
They do a really nice job at the tail end of principal marks, yeah.
Yeah. And so I, hope that in terms of like thinking differently about how we educate and meet kids where they are, I think we need to do more of that. But I also went to my elementary school, and I found that it was like exactly how I remembered it, which is a problem, right? And so as someone who cares deeply about making sure that all of our schools have libraries, I'd like to know the number of our schools, percentage-wise, or numbers that don't have libraries, if you know that.
I think someone on my team might know. I don't know, Christine Landry, if you could come down and answer. Yeah, go ahead.
They're going to look that information up, and I just wanted to address SLIFE. We have seen an increase of SLIFE students this year, post-COVID, as well as the political climate.
Yep, a lot of students coming from
and we have many of them, unfortunately, I live in the Brighton, East Boston, so we have sort of maxed out our capacity. There's literally no space at East Boston. We have maxed out the capacity there. We've added classrooms to Brighton High School. The principals, headmasters have been amazing, but certainly has been a challenge, and we're adding more classroom seats as well next year.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, my question is around libraries, the number of schools that don't have libraries, but the library that even exists at Taylor School is not a good library, just isn't. And so we got a lot of work to do even in the schools that have libraries. So like, in the previous hearing, I was like, we got to know what is the baseline we want in each school. But we need buildings and facilities that are dignity affirming, especially in schools that high populations of immigrant students, high population of Black and brown students, right? Facilities and experiences that really are quality and dignity affirming. Books, we're going to continue to push this native language thing. Books that are in their native language. I was over at Eggleston Library, and they're doing a really great job of getting books on the shelves that are in Spanish, right? I want to see that also in our public schools. I don't want just a library that's a sorry excuse for a library, like really robust, that it's also, thinking about we're in 2022, what do libraries look like? How are we infusing it with like the digital, with the technology that libraries have in 2022?
Yeah.
And then I have one more about data, yeah.
But I can quickly respond to that, and thank you for that question.
Can you state your name and?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Christine Landry, Assistant Superintendent for Academics and Professional Learning. And couldn't agree more with you. And we're really proud of the investment that we're making in libraries. We have 49 schools currently that have active libraries. So
out of how many?
Out of
125.
Yeah. So 49 right now. But
out of 125.
Yes. But as you said, about the Taylor, even the schools that do have active libraries right now will be part of this refresh and sort of renewal process. So the Taylor, for example, their year's 2025, where they're going to receive new collection, updates to their books. They also will be receiving this current year, along with all of our schools, the digital access that you're talking about too, in alignment to the state systems and other quality systems that are available. And as well, we'll also take on the responsibility of paying for the librarian themselves, right, to make sure that those positions continue, because they're often positions that are cut when schools are looking to make changes, and that's why we are at 49 right now.
We would be able to guarantee that every school, I'm going to just, President Flynn put an ask out there. My ask is that every school has a library and has a librarian. That's something that I want us to achieve.
Yeah, that's part of our
in deep partnership with their local libraries too. It's part of my experience as a student at the Taylor.
And I would just quickly add the other piece of the puzzle, I think, is that we are working closely with Simmons and other local universities on with their library programs to ensure that we have diverse, talented librarians who can join our forces, right? We're going to be hiring a lot of librarians, and there aren't a lot of librarians available right now, so we need to grow our own. And so we're working with local universities to do that.
Thank you. You have another?
One last question around data. I asked this question during our first hearing, but it just seems to me that, based on the first hearing that we had today, that we do collect a lot of data as a district, but it seems like sometimes the data just sits there. Or we're not doing a good enough job collecting data around reasons why we're actually able to attract students back, from charter schools or from whatever school environment, or the reasons why our students are leaving. So what is it that we need? You know, I think there were some great questions asked earlier about central office. I don't really want to go into the dynamics of that, knowing, I'll just say that we need strong leadership. But like, why aren't we manipulating data better to our advantage, to tell our story, to tell the things that we're doing well, and what are the challenges that we experience around using the data to show our prowess, right? Because like, people like to say all the things that we're doing wrong as an urban school district, right? Receivership's on the table for whatever reason, you know, but we're actually doing some things right. So what are our failures in terms of data, using our data?
I'll start, and then Monica Hogan, who's sitting next to me, is the Senior Executive Director of the Office of Data and Accountability. One, I do think we have some good systems and structures in place. I think part of the challenge in the past, this is my third time working in the BPS, and the most recent time I was here before returning, I think we had a lot of concerns from our school leaders and our educators that the assessments that we were using were not high quality.
What do you mean?
The assessments, so the ways that we were administering sort of tests or assessments for students, the teachers didn't have a lot of confidence that those assessments were high quality, and so they didn't necessarily have trust in the data. I think what we've tried to do under Monica's leadership and working with some members of her team is to engage in a much more sort of collaborative discussion with our union partners and our educators to ensure that they're at the table when we're making selections about assessments. So I think we're in a place now where our educators have much more confidence in that the types of assessments that we're using are high quality, and as a result, they're getting better information from that. Under Monica's team, we've invested in data inquiry facilitators, and these are individuals who have a set of analytic skills who can help schools analyze both quantitative and qualitative data and help principals and their instructional leadership teams think through what story is the individual data telling us about how our school is performing, and where do we need to make adjustments as a school in terms of the instructional practice. I think I'm interested in partnering with Monica to think about how to increase those investments, because I think they're really powerful positions. They're ones that we get really high quality feedback from our educators and from our principals and school leaders around that investment, and I think it helps offer sort of an analytic heft at the school that sometimes, particularly from the quantitative perspective, that our educators might struggle with, and these people help facilitate that dialogue. And then finally, I will say that I think to a question that Councilor Murphy started with is I think we're taking a much closer look than we have in the past about our early intervention assessments, particularly in the area of literacy, where we have to be far more proactive in what our individual students need and develop the systems and structures that Farah and others are leading around these student support teams to really have high quality conversations that are structured well, that are thinking about, all right, a student is struggling here relative to literacy instruction. What are the actual practices that we're going to put in place to help move the needle for those individual students? And I think we're getting to a point of systematizing that work. I just think we have some more work to do through the investments that we're making.
Can I just also add, and I apologize to expand on a already comprehensive answer, but I think our answer this morning that's prompting your question around data analysis was incomplete. Because you were specifically asking about our ability to understand and analyze enrollment data and how we could compete against charter schools better. And our answer was incomplete because we do look at that. And I think Dr. Eccleston gave a great answer in terms of how we're using academic data. And Monica's team does a great job of looking at academic data. There is a separate team that's responsible for looking at enrollment patterns and how students navigate the system. It's called the Planning Analysis Team. They have really sophisticated models and really understand the flow of students. We've developed fact-based to understand and inform our Build BPS process. There's also a talented team on the operations side, an analyst who is responsible for building and understanding our facilities data. There's better analysis that's specifically around our transportation data. Each of these different data sets require a different set of skills and knowledge to really ream a lot of information out of it and turn it from something that is data into something that is really actionable intelligence and information. And so I do think that we have places where we had gaps in the past that we're building muscle. And I think operations is a great example of that. The information we're now getting about our buildings is better than at any point I've seen in my time at BPS, which is over 10 years now. And so I just wanted to say that because it highlights that we're trying to get more and more information. We're also trying to partner with the city, who has a lot of rich data for us to leverage, including the Boston Planning and Development Agency. So I don't want you to think that we're like sitting on our hands and not using a lot of the information, but you know, it's hard for us to tell that story because it does end up becoming pretty complicated and nerdy, if I can say so, about the way we look at all of these trends across different categories of work.
Well, I mean, I'm here for the nerdy. If that's going to help, no, I'm serious. If that's going to help inform the change that we have to do here in our city, or the story that we need to tell, I get really frustrated in the education space, especially in the equity space, especially when we're talking about Black and brown kids, especially. Because I think that we accept data points as facts, and I've seen this, and it's trying my best not to curse here. It is heartbreaking, right? And I think it's because we accept data as fact, and we just sit on the data, and we don't actually do anything with it. And so my ask is that if there's a capacity issue, which is what I thought it was based on our first session, how do we build out the capacity so that we have folks who are analyzing that data to inform the transformative work that we need to do in our schools?
And the racial equity planning tool, which Dr. Eccleston referenced earlier, there's 2 steps in it that require us to take a look at the data and offer our interpretation. One of the things that a number of our advocates have pointed out, in particular on the racial equity planning tools that I've used in the finance side and some of the ones we've used on Build BPS, is that we will often publish the data that we're looking at, but we don't publish our interpretation of the data. So we'll say, we broke down the students who have access to this by race, and they've pushed us to really say, no, we want you to be very explicit and transparent in your interpretation, so that when we have a different interpretation, I'm hearing this is the same thing you're pointing out, that when you look at the data and assert a fact that is incorrect, that we can call you on it, and then we can give you an alternative interpretation of the data. Because there is, there are multiple ways to engage in that information. I think that's a really, that in my own personal learning and growth in using the racial equity planning tool, I think that's a great opportunity for us to be explicit in our interpretation of what's happening so that others can say, that's not right. What you should be looking at is this. And I think the way that you've asked questions around students who are chronically absent or students who have different educational experiences challenges us to really think differently about how we're analyzing and interpreting that data.
Probably pass them by.
Oh, sorry.
One thing I wanted to add, I just really appreciate the question and to nerd out for a moment and say, I think we need to have a clear academic return on investment, and we need to be able to communicate to the community, these are the investments we've made, here are the improvements in academic outcomes as a result of that. And I'm really interested in partnering with Monica, not only to publish in collaboration with our community a clear research agenda, but also systematize our work so that we're much clearer with our community about the degree to which the investments we're making are leading to academic outcomes for our students.
You can't nerd out without the numbers or your reports or the data or the equity data that we asked for. We can't nerd out on any of this. It's all theoretical and hypothetical unless we see it. So I think that we're patient and we are extending ourselves and saying, bring it so that we can do that. But other than that, it's just a lot of fancy talk. Every single one of you sound brilliant. You sound eloquent, you sound great. You do your job well, I'm sure. But you're just doing it on a formula that doesn't work. And so we're saying, let's partner so that we can look at the data and fix it. Councilor Braden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to sort of touch into the whole area of STEM education, and we're seeing this huge number of new labs, and the biotech industry is just blowing up. Boston is considered one of the premier locations for biotech in the world. And not all of these labs are going to need PhD scientists, but we could do those. We could prepare our students to be those PhD scientists as well. But I really feel that I'd love to just get some idea about how we're doing in terms of STEM education, not only at high school level, but in K through 6, and also just to check in on what do our teaching lab facilities look like, and are just like folks are concerned about libraries. I think to do STEM education, we need teaching labs, and we need materials and opportunities for our students to learn about science and whatever.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the microphone. I think your question is a really important one, and the facility side of this, I think, like the question on libraries, is woefully inadequate in its current structure, and I appreciate that we're trying to do some work on this relative to build BPS, but I do think it's a real barrier and a problem for us, and probably, in some ways more appropriate to dig into it in the Capitol hearing. But I do think it's something that we need to be sensitive to and we need to be able to respond to. In terms of the sort of curriculum and the programming, I do think there are some exciting things that are happening on this front, and some of them are looped into our work on our sort of high school redesign. So I mentioned in my earlier opening comments that our strategy around how to improve the secondary experience of students starts with a clear the MAS core graduation requirements for all students, as well as inclusion and native language options. And then there's what the superintendent calls the core 4. One of those core 4s involves sort of innovation pathways and career technical programs for students. And there's pathways that we can be building out. So if a school, for example, has students who are interested in biomedical sciences, we can build out a pathway of courses that prepares students to potentially get some sort of certificate as a result of that work and to have those sort of academic programs. In some of our schools that have this specific program around biomedical sciences, they might go, and some of them do, go to Harvard Medical School campus, and they have simulation classes. So it's like building off of their work. I had a chance to observe some of these classrooms with some of my colleagues. It's building off of the content that they get in the classroom and allowing them to apply their learning in case-based, sort of practical-based experiences in ways that they might find in nursing school or medical school or in biolabs as part of college. And our goal as part of this high school redesign is to work with our schools to have and decide which pathways they want to invest in as part of their school. With our partnership with Edvestors and the Boston Foundation, we'll be investing in 7 high schools for next year to build out these pathways, and be expanding that to all secondary schools across the system. So my colleagues who are here could also speak, if you're interested in hearing about some of the K-6 science curriculum investments. There have been new investments recently in new curriculum that is more appropriately aligning to the new science standards and engineering standards, and those are really important investments so that our students, when they get from the K-6 and enter into 7-12, are prepared for the types of new STEM opportunities that we're offering that we haven't historically.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing more about the K-6, because I also think you can't start science education. You don't start science education when you hit 9th grade. You start science education in preschool, really, so depending on your exposure, it creates curiosity and innovative thinking from an early age. And
absolutely. I think we want all of our students to be makers and doers and to be creative. And I know that this is an area that our Superintendent Andrew is also pushing on. We do have an open SciEd curriculum that we've invested in that has been, so one of the challenges with the state as well is that we have to meet the Massachusetts state frameworks Ironically, that also means that a lot of materials that we would like to adopt, for example, don't necessarily meet all of the state standards, in particular with engineering and STEM. And so there is a limitation, and so there are a lot of also great curriculum units that we've developed through our Excellence for All team. That team has worked with particular schools to really advance STEM education, in addition to coaches and STEM coaches that have been deployed across the district. But I see that Christine joined us. I'm sure she'd be happy to add other context to this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Farah. The other context I would add is that we are still in partnership with GE. We have been for several years, and the focus of that partnership is on K-6 science instruction in the district, and as Farah noted, really focusing in on curriculum first. So they've supported us in upgrading all of our elementary curriculum for K through 5, and then Open SciEd in the middle schools, which is aligned to all of the current science standards, much more hands-on, much more of a focus on engineering that prepares students for different types of science in high school. With our partnership with GE, we have 15 science coaches in our elementary settings right now who are supporting mostly in transformation schools, supporting and building capacity of all teachers to see themselves as science teachers in the classroom. We've served 6,476 students with that program so far. We have 129 teachers trained. All of our middle schools are now using Open SciEd, which is incredibly exciting. We've been leaders in that work in the state, and DESE is sending lots of people to us to learn about science education in the elementary and middle school area, which we're very, very excited about and will help with the pathways that Drew spoke about.
And the other, I've taken a leaf out of Councillor Flaherty's. He constantly references the fact that this is Boston and we have more colleges per square inch than anywhere else in the world probably. And really having access to those partnerships with our high school colleges of education, and you mentioned Harvard Medical School and whatever, it's really, it seems like a huge untapped resource of potential tutors and mentors and facility access and all sorts of things. That brings me to the question about partnerships and how I understand there's only one person at BPS who is sort of focused on partnerships, and it seems like maybe we're leaving a lot of resources on the table if we don't ramp that up a little.
Yeah, I think there's currently, the partnership office has gone through a period of transition under the Family and Community Advancement team. And so I do think that there's, I think currently one member of the team right now, but they are adding additional resources for partnerships, particularly around industry partnerships, to be able to expand in this way. And then individual schools, part of the idea of the allocation through the Opportunity Index for partnership funds is for schools to be able to be creative and target partnerships around their specific needs. And so that's part of the work that schools do to identify partnerships. Dr. McIntyre this morning referenced partnering with Wheelock and other schools to get social worker interns and resources for their students. I think those are great opportunities for us to continue to explore, and yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think the other, Madam Chair, do I have a second?
Sure.
This is more of a comment. I think one of the challenges, I hear it all the time in the media and in our discussions about equity in every aspect of our lives, is that the absence or the very low visibility of people of colour, and especially women of colour in science spaces. So it's really, I know from talking to community members who are involved in a local church that they're immigrants, they're from Africa, they have PhDs, they're working at MIT, and they just really, they're again another resource that we have to try and present our student population with people who come from similar backgrounds, and that they can see successful scientists who are Black and women, and that they can have role models that they can aspire to follow. And I think that's a huge challenge as well, that we have to really identify, and so that the teachers, of science teachers and the science professionals are reflective of the population of our school district as well.
Thank you. President Councilor Flynn has joined us again, or has returned, and just wanted to give you the opportunity. We had a second round if you have any questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize to my colleagues and to the BPS team for being late. I had a medical appointment that I needed to attend. I don't have any questions. I don't have any comments. I know I missed a lot of this, so I'm just going to watch the video tonight, and I'll follow up if necessary. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, President Flynn. Hope all is well with you and family. I think that, a lot of my questions are sort of, it just feels like attached to everybody, and I would have liked to see like one map, one, data source where we can reference everything and we can look at all of this, in one platform. And so I'm going to ask you to send us more information. I know that I touched on the equity piece, right? So let's just do an inventory of what that was. One was that we take all the questions on equity and that we put it into a PowerPoint presentation. If there were questions that you felt like it was more of a list, that's okay. Like, fill that in a slide. And then I asked for, because we're sort of, shaping this and all of the questions that are here. Then we asked specifically for ratio of service per pupil. So basically, how many social workers, how many services, third-party agencies, if you have any outpatient contracted coming in, if you have psychologists, if you have nurses, liaisons, FCOCs, any of those services that are in schools, family partners, and then the ratio of pathologists, like how do you measure that and where are those numbers? And now it seems like, we're talking about libraries, so we asked about how many schools, so 125, 49 schools have libraries, but we're asking that all schools eventually get to that. The other thing is AP classes. How many schools actually offer AP classes? What AP classes each school offers? And then the other thing is facility. Contrary to what some may say, facilities are extremely important. And I mentioned this earlier, we are our environment. We feel what, people behave accordingly to what they feel they deserve. And if you are asking children to come to basements, cold basements, to sit on the floor and it looks bad, then they feel that way, right? So I won't belabor that point, but I would like to know, in terms of your facilities, according to what you believe schools need, all of the resources in your facilities, send us a list of the 125 schools, right? And then say, this one needs bathroom, this one needs a gym, this one needs art, this one needs science. We want to know what's missing from each school. We can never come back to this conversation and reference anything if we don't know where the deficits were. So for our purposes of measuring and figuring out what progress we've made as a council, we would like to get that information so that by fall, when you're preparing, we're helping you with that. Remember when we talked about your process to selecting schools? We know what schools you picked to redo, right? But the issue is that in Mattapan, there are schools that need to be redone. So we want to fairly assess that with you and say, we get it. We understand why only these schools are being redone. Or we understand why these schools are getting a gym next. Mm-hmm. Or why this school has a priority for a swimming pool. We cannot do that unless we have the full picture, unless we fully assess where the needs are, how long they've been decrepit for, or what we're doing here. So I think you get the point. I mean, I don't have to go on and on and on, but my last point is about code of conduct in the interest of, harm reduction or reducing harm to school to prison pipeline. What are we, or how are we investing, other than mindfulness and classes and all this other stuff? Are we investing in financial literature in our curriculums? Are we implementing programs in schools to complement that, to give children incentives to look forward to something else? And are there any work programs for students, especially in high school? Because and I want to know, because I want to work with you and how we can turn that into policies, that maybe it's a program where kids are getting paid to do homework. Maybe it's a job and a homework program. And I have something like that, right? I was getting ready to file something like that. And before we get into that, I'd like to see where you are with that.
The team member who runs the code of conduct work is not here today, unfortunately, and it's not a part of my division. I'd be happy to follow up with that person and get an answer to you. I just don't know all the answers to the code of conduct questions.
Okay. Thank you. We'll do another last round. This is our third round.
We'll make sure the team's ready for Monday, too, for that.
Okay, thank you. To Councilor Lujan's point, what is the timeline of you getting these informations to us?
Sorry, the timeline for which specific?
One, the data. Two, equity presentation. We want data on service per pupil, and then we want data of the facilities and the need for each school.
Okay.
And we want the presentation on equity. And the equity, the questions are very specific, right? So it would say, BPS is 70%, blue or whatever, right? And then we would know where we are and how we're leading by example, and if we're not, what the need is.
The request that you had for the equity packet, that was part of forgetting the letters that were, the RFI, the request for information, whatever it was, we will have that information to you by Monday. For the breakdown of positions that are funded as part of our quality guarantee and the formula, the basis for which the social workers, the family liaisons, the calculations, we can have that by the next hearing as well. The questions that you asked about facilities, there are three parts to that, and we will have those more detail in anticipation of the facilities hearing, which I believe is not until March 31st, but maybe we can provide that information ahead of time. The first is a prioritized building list on building conditions. This is our current available.
Sorry, did you say March 31st?
I'm sorry, I meant May.
Sorry. Thank you.
But I probably did say March. Apologies. So
No, I didn't hear it, and then I was like, wait, are we talking next year?
If I could table it till next year, Counselor. So the building list is our current available data on building conditions and how we are prioritizing building repairs. This is about existing resources like roofs, boilers, windows. The second thing is we are contracting out and just launched a project to do a facilities condition assessment, an FCA. That's a major project to have outside group come in and assess the quality and needs of all of our existing buildings. That's run out of Indy Alvarez's shop, the facilities team. She's the chief of operations. That will tell us what repairs are needed and give us a really comprehensive scope of the cost of upgrading our existing building stock.
I remember you mentioned that. When is that being done?
The project is launching now, and I believe the anticipation is that it's an 18-month project to assess all of our buildings. The third piece that you're asking about is a statement and an assessment around the educational opportunities and resources at every building, meaning which of our buildings have a cafeteria, which have a gymnasium. We're launching a new K-6, 7 to 12 study that is meant to be our statement on what every school should have from a facilities perspective. So it's saying, the definitive statements of saying every 7 through 12 should have X number of STEM labs or maker spaces per student. It should have a gym, it should have a cafeteria, it should
We
have.
don't know what schools need now?
We don't. We
need a
don't have a
study?
comprehensive list. There was a work that was done in Build BPS several years ago, but it did not adequately provide us with the information we needed. This is a gap for us as a district and one that they're working on closing right now.
And
The other thing is
how long is that project, the K to 6 and 7 to 12 study?
that is anticipated to, I believe, be a 6 to 12 month study to come up with what we think every building should have. But I will say that we have not, as a district or as a city, come up with a definitive statement about what we want every school to have. I know each person has their own definition, but we have not had a building standard to say when we build a new K to 6, it's going to have all of these things and be all of these size. It's been something that's been a gap for us as a district.
We haven't?
Not since really the early 2000s when Orchard Gardens, Mildred Ave, and several other schools were built. That was the last time we had a comprehensive sort of building program. The buildings that are being built now are all individual tailored projects that they have gone in and said, okay, what do we need to do for the Boston Arts Academy? Or what do we want to do for this elementary school that we're renovating, or the Quincy Upper project? But those are very tailored and specific projects that then can't be replicated across other sites and other programs. So what we're trying to do is come up with sort of our standard of saying this is what we're building towards when we talk about building a new K to 6 school.
Council Mejia, you have a record? You have the floor?
No, I just want to be mindful that I just want to because I know we're supposed to end at 5, and I'm not sure if we're going to get another round, right? It's from 2 to 5. And if we're going to get another round, just want to make sure that's going to happen, because if it's not, I can go get myself prepped for something else that I have. So I just want to make sure that I manage my expectations, and I just wanted to check in with you, Chair, if we're going to do a third round.
Councilman Mejia, I will be patient with you if you'll do the same for me. I will immediately go into third round as soon as he's finished answering that. Thank you. I got the 6 to 12 months study, thank you. And I think the last part was about if you can answer the question, not today, I'm saying get back to us. I was just listing and then you went on to explaining in terms of the actual process for prioritizing schools in terms of who goes first and who gets what.
We'll be prepared to talk about that at the facilities overview hearing. That's the purpose of kind of talk about the steps and priorities that we've made for the FY23 capital plan, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. I think, Councilor Mercy, I'm sorry, I lost track of were you first?
Councilor Flynn had his light on. I'm not sure if he wanted to say something.
Councilor Flynn, did you have your light on?
Yes.
You have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And
Thank you, Councilor Mejia.
thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the BPS team, just listening to the conversation. And just want to acknowledge your honesty, Nate, about, the lack of assessments that we probably should have done. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, which you have. So I respect that. So I just wanted to follow up on that. Would a potential BPS superintendent ask for an assessment of buildings, ask for an assessment of academics? A potential BPS superintendent, would they ask for an assessment of the current conditions of schools, academic, social and emotional related issues before they accept the job? So the reason I'm asking that is a superintendent needs to know what they're coming into, obviously. But if that work is already done for a potential new superintendent, is that something that city council members could have access to that would certainly help me, but maybe help my colleagues too as we prepare for the budget?
That's a great question. I know as part of the superintendent's transition plan, she's ensured that we have a smooth transition, has asked us to begin to document our work and provide information on where projects stand and what it needs to move forward. I can't begin to imagine what a new superintendent coming into the district would want to see, but I'm sure, what we saw from our current superintendent was she wanted to get out in the schools and see them right away. So, that was her way of assessing the condition and the sort of lay of the land. And I think you were asking for access to those transition documents. I'd need to go back and talk to the team about.
Yeah, but is it standard practice for a superintendent? Would they necessarily want an audit done on a school district before they accept an offer? I don't know how that would work, but I would assume if you are a BPS superintendent, a national superintendent, you're seeking one of these high-profile positions, Boston, New York, Chicago, that you would ask these types of questions prior to acceptance of an offer.
It's not standard practice to ask for a complete audit of the district before accepting. I know that often candidates will have access to strategic planning documents, or in the past, our Build BPS planning documents. And I would imagine they'd want to get a good sense of the current sort of finance, instructional landscape, so they understand what the challenges are as a district that they're taking on. And I know that it'll be each superintendent, I would imagine, will come in and have their different strengths and the areas where they'll need to sort of dig in deeper. And I've seen that with over the transitions that have happened just while I've been here, each superintendent has sort of dived in and focused on a different part based on feedback they've gotten from the community or what they're hearing from city councilors when they first arrive. So it depends on the candidate and depends on sort of what feedback they hear and what direction they want to go in.
Okay. And I guess my final point on that question. So when a superintendent does accept the job, I would assume that a superintendent would want some type of update on how the schools have been doing over the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, an audit, I guess. They know what the challenges are, the weaknesses are, the strengths are. Are we working on that report now so it's ready for the new superintendent when he or she comes in, so that they can be fully updated and hit the ground running on the challenges and strengths of the system?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges we're coming into taking over a district with the complexity and history of Boston is that how they can get up to speed on, I think we've had different conversations about individual school communities and the need to understand the history of how they've been treated by the district and what their challenges are. As part of the superintendent's transition, she has asked each of the divisions to begin documenting their work and flagging current status of projects. We've also, we do have different profiles of schools that we can put together, and then the school superintendent team you met, Dr. McIntyre this morning and Dr. Tavares, and there's a team of school superintendents who are the experts in those individual school communities and will help prepare and brief the new superintendent as they come in.
Thank you. And my final point, it's really not a question, just something I would recommend, is maybe every year or every 18 months, regardless of who the superintendent is or regardless of who the mayor is, there should be a written in-depth assessment of BPS, of what's working, what's not, so that anytime anyone wants to look at that type of an assessment, city councilors, the public, parents, it's available, but it's a document that's always updated that can be useful and helpful. I don't like when we do something to start it now and then it'll take us 2 years to have it done. I'd rather us continue to update a document like that. But anyway, thank you to the BPS team for your leadership. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Council Murphy, you have the floor.
So I have a couple questions to close out. One, I'll list them all and then we can answer them. After-school programming for our special ed students. We know we have to do better at before and after-school programming across the district, but if you could speak on opportunities for our students with special needs, and many times the school does not offer proper programming, and what are we doing if the school can't? What other options are we giving these families and students? When it comes to libraries, I know when we went K to 8, we used to be K to 5, the state does not require a library, right? And then you get a middle school, high school that has different DESE requirements. So, when we talk about 49 libraries, some schools, if they're just elementary, may not require them, but are we investing in? Because I worked at a school with a wonderful big library that had a certified librarian, and there was a time when principals could replace the librarian, who is paid like a teacher, with a library para, because it wasn't legally required to. So are we investing in putting librarians back into our schools? Also, I do say when I look at my kindergarten picture from the Murphy School, the orange bookshelves from when I was there in 1974 are still there. So even though we do have libraries in certain buildings, they definitely need some love. And then I worked at the Henderson, which had no library, 10 small schools, but amazing spaces where we created reading nooks or whatever. So it is an individual, somewhat on some base, what's happening where. And the last is the inclusion model. The Henderson does it one way, other schools have rolled it out different ways. Many people feel that it's more of a burden on a teacher and not the supports aren't there. So if you could just talk about your vision going forward and how we decide which model goes at which school, and especially as we're hoping to have more inclusion across the district. Thank you.
I'll do my best to help them and try to be succinct. So I'll take the second question first on libraries. I want to be clear that I think your question, some of the examples you pointed out, is that even in the schools where we have 49, or even though we have 49 libraries, many of them are still inadequate, right? So it takes investments in those libraries too. Some of them might be more cosmetic, but others are going to be really, really significant overhauls to the spaces because they're in spaces that are not appropriate for students and for libraries more generally. I think your description of what happened here is totally right on, is that in the past the district had invested in these positions and having libraries more broadly. Through autonomies and other things, principals may have made decisions to either eliminate that position when they maybe face budget cuts for their own individual school budget, and or to replace librarians with library paras. What we're trying to do to prevent that from happening in the future is to invest in that from the operating budget. We're using our ESSER monies to ensure that the sort of one-time cost of the materials, the books, and that is being spent through money that we won't have into the future. But we're planning for a long-term investment so that every school has access to a library in their school, or through a partnership, a robust or through a partnership with BPL at every school across the entire city. So that's the plan, not just at our high schools, but across our pre-K to 12 schools. Relative to the question on inclusion, I think it's really important that we note that I think one of the fundamental flaws of the ways that we've approached special education more broadly in the city of Boston is that we've approached this in a way to assume that everyone who has a certain profile needs the same exact thing. Mm-hmm. And that is not consistent with what special education is asking us to do. And so I can't say to you, every student who deserves to have access to an inclusion seat should have exactly these sorts of resources. Those are things that have to be developed at an individual child level from the team discussion based on the individual needs of the decision. Otherwise, it's not special education in the way that it's intended to be. I think I mentioned to an earlier comment, I will say that it's at least my perspective, having sat in negotiations with the BTU, and I'm certainly not going to talk about anything that I shouldn't, but I do think that it's important to both the district and to the BTU to get this right. I think we do have some disagreements about how we are going to do it, but I know that in the coming weeks and months we need to roll up our sleeves together as a team and come up to a solution that not only ensures that our students have access to what they need from an inclusion perspective, but that we don't either over-scaffold or over-support when that's not necessary. And then on the first question around after school and before school programming, I'm not sure that I fully understood the spirit of what you're trying to get at. It sounds like maybe there's some access issues. Is that?
Well, we know equitably across the district, that not every school offers the same level of before and after school programming. And if some charge, some don't, some have great programming that comes in from outside sources, some doesn't. But my big question, that is an issue we definitely need to address, but the special ed access for students. Many students, especially if they're not in an inclusion setting like the Henderson, they're told they can't sign up for certain after-school programming if they don't have the right supports.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree, and I will say that, and we've gotten a lot of feedback not only from our community, like this is like the one thing that when the superintendent has shared, when she went out to the community to talk about investments in ESSER, like people really want to ensure that we have before and after school care. And we've gotten this feedback from the school committee as well. I don't think that we yet have a clear plan of how to deliver on a promise of high quality before and after school care at every school in the system. And right now it's sort of an ad hoc individual school basis. That's unacceptable. It's also inconsistent with what our quality guarantee articulates, and that this should be an expectation, a foundational expectation across every school in the BPS. And so I'll have to come back to an answer of like how we scale that up. But I do know that it's important to our superintendent and to our school committee and to our community more broadly to ensure that that happens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor Mayhew, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to uplift that a lot of the questions that the Chair was asking, it's startling to hear that we don't have that, which, Nate, I always go right back to you because we've been at this now for 3 years. These are some of the same questions that I've been asking. And what I find to be really interesting, and this is not, I'm not even gonna ask questions, I'm gonna use my time to just talk, okay? Is that as a parent and as a Boston Public School graduate, and you already know my journey, it's really interesting how it is for me to be here as a city councilor and to have to sit here and ask you guys, Farah's new, ask y'all questions, and you're new too, but Nate. And it's frustrating because I find that sometimes I ask the same questions that other people ask, but you act, Nate, like you're just hearing it for the first time. And maybe it's because of my demeanor, or maybe it's because I'm not as articulate. I just don't know what it is. But I think that that's why so many parents, when it comes to engagement and when it comes to feeling heard, that we don't feel heard. Because the white dominant culture responds and feels more comfortable with people who can speak in ways that you can hear it. And I think that I have a responsibility in whatever little 2 years that I have left on this council to continue to bring all of myself into this space and not adapt to what makes everyone else feel comfortable so that I could be here fully expressed and not feel like I need a translator. And the reason why I went to you is because some of the same questions that Councilor Louis-Jean was asking around chronic absenteeism, around ELLs, these are the same questions that I've been asking for the last 3 years. And all of a sudden, it sounds like we're finally getting there. That to me feels a little bit dismissive. I just want to call that out. And that's how so many of our families feel when they're interacting with BPS, when they're fighting for their children, when they're trying to get their special education needs met, when they don't know how to speak English, and they get all the materials in a language that they can't understand, right? These are all of the things. We can talk about academics all we want, but if we're not talking about how we're going to shift the culture and the dynamics and how we show up for families, all of this is just talk, right? Like, you have to really think about this. All of these great intentions and these PowerPoint presentations, which I go back to, it's just talk. If there's no real intention around shifting the culture and how you perceive our students, you want to talk about data, you always lead with all of the things our kids don't have. But what about the resiliency that they do bring to the table? And everything that they have to overcome just to show up in school? How are we celebrating and measuring that in terms of growth? Right? When you talk about academic success, it's not just about the rigor. We talked about the whole child yesterday. Where's the whole child in this conversation? If we're not talking about how these children can show up as their full selves in a classroom and see themselves reflected. I'm glad that we got rid of, I don't know which hearing was, about the way people on the walls, and now we have more joy. That's great. But we need to do more. And these budget hearings, like for me, I want to come here and feel like I'm making a difference. I don't want to come here and waste my time and be here for another 2 years and nothing has changed for the families that put me here. And so I'm frustrated, beyond frustration. And I think some of it goes to what the chair was talking about, the fact that we don't know what we don't know. So how are we going to fix it if we haven't really done the work to assess it in a way that is more tangible? And that's not a question. That's just a statement. And I don't have anything else to say other than that. We need to get it together because our people are counting on us to fight like hell for them. And I'm not here to play politics. I'm here to do my job, which is to fight. And I'm here for that, and only that. And I'm not gonna water down any of it to make anyone feel comfortable. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mejia. It's kind of hard, you know, when in anything that we do, it's kind of hard to hear something so eloquently put with so much sincerity and be able to just sort of shift to another counselor or another topic. So I want to thank you for always being strong in opening yourself up, in advocating for the community, for Boston. And I heard you loud and clear, and I felt it deeply, because when I said about the being a polyglot, it's a problem. I learned a bunch of languages so that I could be viable as an undocumented person for 17 years to find jobs. And so I taught myself how to read and write and speak these languages so I could make money, because I didn't have a green card to go to college at the time. So I heard I think I've read on your story, Farah, as well. And so it resonates with us. It resonates with Councilor Lujan, I know for sure. And Councilor Murphy, who's spoken about being a teacher and understanding children, immigrant students with this need. And Councilor Ed Flynn, who's always talking about his Asian and Latin population who suffer from this. So to be seen and to be heard is it's a very human need that we all, I think, can share. And I think as our white brothers and sisters, I know that you share the sentiment, and I hope that we can be more organic and sincere about this process. And I don't think you're dishonest. I just think that intentionality has to be followed through, and we don't have the time. Everybody goes to their job, gets paid, and we just rush it, right? And then we have to approve a budget in like less than 2 months. It sucks. So we can't properly respond, as Councilor Mejia is saying. I don't want to take up time because I have nothing else to say. I just wanted to say something about that because it's hard to open up and not address it. Councilor Lujan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have, I think, mostly comments similar to Councilor Mejia, although I do have one question. It should be short, but I just want to uplift, like, it is what Chair Fernandez Anderson was saying. Okay, if we are going to wait to have this K through 6, 7 through 12, like, this is what every school should have, fine. If we need to wait for that, that study's going to happen, fine. But what we must have accompanying that is what she asked for, which is that breakdown of what our schools currently do and don't have. What schools do have a cafeteria, what schools don't have an auditorium, what schools don't have, like, we need that. And I need that by neighborhood, particularly because I'm an at-large city councilor, particularly because there are neighborhoods that I come from, like Mattapan, where I go back and I look at my elementary school, like, what? Like, this looks the exact same? What, like, it's like someone punched through the wall and it hasn't been fixed? Like, what's going on? And, like, the fact that there are students that are like, they ask for an elevator and they're like, but wait, am I being too needy? Like, you deserve an elevator in your school. And so these are things that we need to have, because it will also make that conversation a lot easier when we're talking about we have to close the school. But we're gonna do this so that every school can have X, Y, Z. But if you don't give us that, we're not gonna be able to help you in that conversation. I'm just saying that right now. We need that. We need that so that we can be able to argue that for reasons of neglect, white supremacy, racism, whatever, our schools don't have what they need. But look, we're trying to give that to you. And we're trying to give that to you through reimagining what our schools look like, through reimagining what those facilities look like, through designing new schools. But we can't do that if we don't know what the baseline is. And a lot of this is about, like, we've made things so complicated for families to understand. It's complicated for me to understand sometimes. And so we need to make it very simple for our families. This is what your schools have and don't have. This is what we're trying to build for you. This is how we're trying to dream alongside all of you. And if you don't give us that data, we're not going to be able to have those smart conversations alongside all of you. And then I'm happy I'd love responses to that. Then my other question is just, like, how much does it cost to have a library in each school and have a library, and what's the numbers behind a fully funded library in each school?
The current expansion plan for librarians, for just the staffing costs and benefits of having the librarians and the expansion of schools that don't currently have it, is $8.5 million.
That would cover all the schools, like I think that's 125 or so, 124 that.
Yeah, our current plan on library expansion is a 3-year expansion, FY23, 24, and 25. So the costs of the librarians over the 3 years would be $8.5 million. If you include all of the one-time costs, furniture, new bookshelves, which I would advocate maintain orange, that would be $14.5 million for that's expansion of collections.
Yep.
And
what needs to happen at Taylor, schools like that. Yep.
Exactly. That doesn't include really what we want to talk about, which is this is converting existing space or doing more libraries in the classroom. I see Christina and Andrew just came up, but it doesn't include building out a brand new library space like you've seen at the Mattahunt, which has a great, beautiful library space. Where, you know, that's the kind of thing that's really part of the vision in the long run.
And that took blood, sweat, and tears. I know people at the Mattapan, and that took so much effort and advocacy and fight before they could get that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry.
I think Nate answered the question pretty thoroughly, but just to break it down a little bit, we have a basic starting cost for a new collection in each school. So for an elementary school, $45,000 in books, $90,000 for high school or 7, 12, based on, you know, because we have so many different grade configurations, there's variability there, but that's sort of our starting piece. And then beyond that, there's the furniture. Only schools that have had upgrades in the last few years through the 21st century furniture investment won't be getting new furniture, but everyone else will be getting brand new furniture and non-orange shelves and all of that. And then workstations for the librarians too, so that they have the material, you know, the resources, the hardware and software that they need to
do you have a per school breakdown of what
we
it
do.
costs?
Yeah.
What is that? Is there an average per school to maintain a library? That's actually what I'm interested in.
Oh, got it, for ongoing maintenance?
Yeah, like how much does it cost? I mean,
Yeah.
maybe it's simplifying a question that isn't that simple, but I kind of want the simple answer.
No, that's a great question, and that's not something we've done before, and we're starting with this investment, is an annual per student allotment per school. And Nate, do you know exactly what the per student is?
Yeah, I would just say, so the cost of a full-time librarian, and in this case, we're not talking about library paraprofessionals, we're talking about full-time librarians, and the schools don't have the discretion to change this. Full-time librarian salary and benefits is approximately $136,000 per year. The estimated cost, again, there's a
136, sorry.
136 for the salary and benefits for that position. The collection maintenance, which is the sort of annual cost, I believe it's based on the total number of students times $10 per pupil to be able to, that's continuously update the collections. So it can range anywhere from $1,800 or $1,600 for a small school to a school like Mildred Avenue, about $6,200 per year for that collection cost. And so that's, you know, the startup cost is planning for a new collection to spend $45,000 for each school to expand the texts that are in the building. And as you mentioned, these are not just books that are in English, but also expanding collections in multiple languages and that are culturally affirming and so forth.
If you'd allow me a moment, I just want to go to public testimony and come back to you.
No, that's it. I don't have anything more.
One person waiting.
Okay, just if anybody wanted to comment on my first, like the data thing, like we need that, or like this doesn't work.
Yeah.
We have to know, like, then it's again about that simplicity and about being able to talk. This is what your schools do and don't have. This is what we're trying to give you.
Yeah, I would just say,
Don't your schools, like doesn't each principal knows what is missing?
so there's two parts to that. I think if you asked, if we specifically said, how many schools have a gym?
No, for example, if you sent out a memo to everyone and you said, send me an inventory, because I know they do, right? But send me an updated inventory of everything that you're missing. A teacher, a principal of that school would know they're missing arts, they're missing a gym, they're missing an auditorium, they need more food, they don't have sensory room, they don't have a place for safe, restrictions. They don't, like a principal would know. So couldn't we send out a memo and get that sooner?
I think every time we've done an assessment like that, invariably we come back without a piece of information that somebody would have said is standard and required at the school. So whether it's the interesting place, when we looked at our schools and were assessing the challenges that we had to respond to the pandemic, one of the things that came out was we didn't have enough separate nursing spaces and then a nursing suite. And when you look at some of our schools, they have multiple separate rooms for a nurse to be able to isolate a student who may have a fever. And then you have other schools that have a single sort of converted closet for a nursing space. So if you did a survey that said, do you have a space for your nurse? If you're not specific in how you ask the question, you'll often get data back.
So could we do a survey that was specific?
I think that is the part of the K-6, 7 to 12 study is meant to come back with a very specific set of expectations that the community wants about what we define as those spaces. And
Study that takes almost a year?
It just must be pre and post. It can't just be what we envision. It has to also have a baseline.
I 100% agree. And we did this 7 years ago for the original Bill BPS assessment. And the data that came back was not sufficient for planning because we rushed it and we didn't do it well. I think what we have, I respect your passion, and I think it's matched in terms of the enthusiasm that I bring to this work. And I have been passionately chasing Build BPS and trying to get it so that we're in a place to do better for our students for at least 6 years that I've been working on it. This work is hard, and there'd be nothing easier than for me to sit here and say, yep, I'll have it to you in 3 weeks. And we'll produce another data set, which we did in the original Build BPS plan, that is insufficient, inaccurate, and does not allow for proper planning. What we're trying to do, and the work that Indy Alvarez is launching and doing a tremendous amount of work and good work on, is doing it well and doing it right. And then every 2 years coming back and saying, you know what, we can't just assess our buildings once and then move on. We need to continuously assess it so that this is something that other districts do and is standard operating procedures that our facilities team has not done in years past. And so when we sit here and testify, there is a real fine line between us sort of saying, you know, I can represent our work and talk about where I can be honest about where I've fallen short and where my team has fallen short. And there's another thing for me to say, yeah, by the way, that operations team that came and testified 18 months ago, they didn't do anything. And now there's a new team that's taking it over and they're doing the work for real this time. And I think it's just difficult. And so the team is organized to make progress on this work in a way that we've not been since I've been here. And I'm both confident in their work, and I can say this is no longer leading the Build BPS work, that the team is in a better position to make progress for you, and so that 18 months from now, 6 months from now, the conversation is not the same. And I apologize that, you know, we have been stuck in this period of telling you it's going to be different and then coming back and nothing's different. So Councilor Mejia, I do hear you, and I recognize how this is the same line of question that you've been asking for multiple years, and the answer hasn't changed. We're going to get to it next year, and this is, you know, what I'm hoping and what I believe is that we'll come back to you next year and say, here's what's different and here's how it's going to be even better the following year.
I wonder if we could ever do a survey to figure out, since BPS is highly inequitable in terms of demographics of staffing or in upper management especially, I wonder if we could do a survey to figure out where upper management sends their children. Do they go to BPS? That would be really interesting to figure out if everybody in upper management and BPS sends their kids to BPS.
I'm the proud parent of 2 BPS students, a 4th grader and a K2 student. So.
You were ready for me, huh? That's great, Nate. Thank you for investing in our district. We have Daniel Ryan Tierney, and then we'll ask if anyone has any closing statements, and then we'll close out. Just bear with us. Oh, thank you. It's Danielle, not Daniel. Butchering people's names. See, this is why I don't ask anyone to pronounce my name correctly. If it looks French, I'm just gonna say it, right? I'm just gonna be like, oh, Danielle. And if it looks Spanish, I'll just say it like that. That's what immigrants do. We just wing it. We just survive. Just make it happen. Make it work. Miss Danielle, if you're with us. All right. I'm going to ask my council colleagues if they have any closing statements or remarks. Going once, going twice. Okay.
I just had,
Okay.
sorry, I thought I pressed.
Councilor Murphy.
Just want to thank you all for being here. I know it's been a long afternoon and we have more hearings to look forward to, but I just quickly did want to touch on the survey and appreciate how difficult it is, knowing that I worked in BPS schools for over 20 years, because there are rooms we call cafetoriums and we have auditoriums that then become gymnasiums, and it works. And I don't think we need to knock down every building and add everything. So it really is a walk through. And when you made that point that we could ask, what do you have? So you might say, well, I don't have this, but you do have a space that does work. And there's no need for addition. And there are times when there are really big things missing. Absolutely. I'm not saying there aren't, but it isn't as easy. But I also do have to say, even though we're a big school district, some people will say 125 schools is not that many to walk through, right? we walked through them. We could do it as a team, and you could have your clipboard and check off, right? So, and it is true that different principals or the question, if it's just asked, would respond. You would need follow-up visits, and so that's, I just wanted to mention that. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Murphy. Councilor Mejia?
So I just want to say thank you for your grace, Chair, and for you all. It is not easy to sit here and listen and know that you're going to come back and have to ask the same questions and hope and pray that things will be different, not just for the hearings, just in general, right? Like when you go back out into the streets, and like, what did you learn? What did they say? How did you make out? What's going to change? And you're like, oh, we're going to have to wait and see. That's a lot. And it's not just for us, it's for you guys too, right? Because you're here, right? And everybody is always talking about accountability, but you all also are holding yourselves accountable to this, right? I said this yesterday, it's not just about BPS. The city council needs to recognize the role that we've played for a long time and allowing the system to be where it's at right now. So a lot of this is even before any of us got on this council, or even before you even applied for this job, right? So we're trying to undo years of systemic inequities, right? So I'm managing my expectations, Nate. I always defer to you because I always like to call your name out. But so I know that to be true, right? So let's just all manage those expectations. But to what Councilor Murphy just mentioned, and because I founded an organization called C-Plan with a group of parent volunteers, and this little small group of parents created a survey that pushed Boston Public Schools to include their questions in their survey. And we did that with no resources. And we were just a group of parents. So I say this to say, let's get our clipboards, right? Let's walk through these schools, and if we have to do it ourselves, let's do it. Because we don't have another year to wait. And then that way, in September, because I'm not gonna wait another year to have you in front of me again. We created a new committee called Government Accountability, Transparency, and Accessibility, which we're gonna create opportunities to invite you all back in and talk about how are things going and what can we do, what interventions we need to do, where we at, how are those dollars being spent, and what we need to do to get us to the finish line. So then that way, when we come back for the budget, and before you prepare the budget, we've had some time to evaluate and support you all, right? To Councilor Fernandez's point, we don't know what we don't know. And so we need to create the infrastructure here on the council to be able to set you up for success. So that when we do that analysis, we know where we're starting from. So I really do appreciate the level of intense questions that you did earlier. It wasn't I was trying to rush you, but I was, because I did have a 5 o'clock, but I canceled that one. But, you know, it's important for us to understand that accountability requires all of us to look at what we are doing and what we're not doing. And the city council, as Councilor Latta said yesterday, we don't have an elected school committee. We are the next best thing to that. And this is our opportunity through the chair to make sure that we are asking you the questions that are gonna get us to a place where we can measure those outcomes. Because all of this is recorded. We can go back and play the tape, and which I will. And I'll be creating a remix and dropping some music underneath it. And I'm gonna send that to you, Nate. Because I will ask you the same question in every hearing until you get it right.
Yo, Mejia got bars.
Thank you.
Right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Councilor Lujan.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that, you know, I'll just speak for myself in that if there's impatience in my voice and in our voices, as a new city councilor, this is my first time sitting through this, right? And I come at this and at all the change that we're seeing and experiencing here in our city with tremendous optimism, knowing the data that exists and knowing that we have a lot of work to do. So it's the sense of urgency and the issues that we have experienced as people who've graduated from BPS, as people who think deeply about inequities and the inequities in our system. So it's out of a tremendous respect for the difficulty of the work that you gotta do, but with the recognition of the urgency of the issues that we face, and not wanting to accept the data points that we hear over and over and over as reality. That is a big fear of mine, that we just accept, and that we're not really pushing beyond what we accept as fact. And so the urgency that you experience is just because we want to get this right, and we want to get this right by the people who have, empowered us to be sitting in these seats. And the things that, keep you up at night, keep me up at night, we just want to get it right. So I just thank you for being here. And I really hope that these aren't repetitive, that we're not asking the same questions a year from now, with the acknowledgement that, of course, the work is hard, right? And that change doesn't happen overnight. But that cannot be my experience, because I don't have the patience for that. So I just hope that we can continue to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor President Flynn?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the important work you're doing, Madam Chair, and providing positive leadership to this body. I also want to thank the BPS team that's also here, that is also providing strong leadership, especially during difficult times in our city and country. And I listen to my colleagues, and I certainly agree with my colleagues about the important work ahead of us, and I respect my colleagues for taking their job very seriously, because I do the same, so I admire and respect their love for the city, but I also know that you also have that same compassion and love for the city as well. I guess my point is that it's critical that we can disagree or challenge each other on issues, and I think that's an important part of the budget process. And I think, Madam Chair, you're doing an excellent job on that. And I also know, in Madam Chair, you're providing the strong example that it's also about us working well together, learning from each other, treating us treating you with respect, and you treating us with respect. So I just want to acknowledge that, in my opinion, that the conversation has been back and forth, but it's still been respectful. So I think that's also a critical part of it, because what we all want is a successful BPS program for our kids, and my wife and I have our son in the BPS system as well. So I want to see a successful BPS for every kid. But anyway, I just want to say thank you to you, Madam Chair, and the dedicated BPS team that's with us today, this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, President Flynn. I will not keep you any longer. I thank you for being here. For the record, my kids did not go to BPS. I wasn't ridiculing. I was just saying that when you feel like you don't have options, it's tough. The funny thing is, when I put them in camp in Maine, they go away to this nice camp in the mountains. They see Weston public schools and they think I have all this money, and then I have to apply for scholarships. I'm like, oh, I don't live in Weston. So that's why I put emphasis on facilities, because I've seen the difference, and I would like every child to have that in Boston. Thank you so much for your patience and tenacity in your work. We respect you, and we know that this looks a lot different than a conversation that may have taken 20, 30 years ago. So please bear with us and bring us our information, and let's get to work. Thank you. See you soon. Meeting adjourned.